Hey friends, welcome back to Sleep History with Sikandar. I am so glad you are here tonight. I want you to picture something before we begin. A room you have never been inside. A room that most people passing this house on a cold morning in 1814 would never in their lives be permitted to see. The curtains are drawn, heavy ones, silk perhaps, or a fabric that approximates silk, in a deep colour, a dusty gold or a quiet green, the kind of colour that was fashionable in the years when England was still at war with Napoleon and nobody quite knew how it would end. Behind those curtains are windows, tall sash windows set into thick plaster walls, and outside those windows the world is still dark, still quiet. The street below, if this is a townhouse, is empty cobblestone. The hour is perhaps 5:30 in the morning, perhaps earlier. And inside this room, behind those curtains, a woman is asleep. She does not know yet that we are here. She does not know that in just a few minutes everything is going to begin again. If this kind of gentle, unhurried journey through history is something that makes your evenings feel a little slower and a little richer, it would mean so much if you hit subscribe and left a like on this video, and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Are you already in bed, on the sofa with the lights dimmed? I love knowing where you are. Now, let those lights go soft. Let the sounds of today fall away, one by one, and let us step, very quietly, through the door of that room. Tonight we're going to spend a long, unhurried evening inside one of the most private spaces in a Regency woman's world. Not the ballroom, not the drawing room, not the carriage, or the park, or the assembly rooms where reputations were made and quietly ruined over a set of country dances. History notices those spaces. Novels fill them with candlelight and carefully weighted conversation. We know those rooms. We've been inside them 100 times. We're going somewhere else. We're going to the bedroom. And here is the thing about that. When most people picture a Regency lady's bedroom, they picture something from a costume drama. Something soft and pastel and rather decorative. A woman reclining prettily near a window. Flowers on the dressing table. A maid hovering at a respectful distance. Nothing particularly happening. Here is what those pictures leave out. A Regency lady's bedroom was not empty. It was not a waiting room. For many women it was the most inhabited space in the entire house. The one room where they could read what they actually wanted to read, write what they actually wanted to write, think what they actually wanted to think, and be, for a few hours at least, something closer to themselves than anywhere else in the house allowed. That room held more of a woman's real life than the drawing room ever did. That is where we are going tonight. So get comfortable, let the room around you settle, and let us begin at the very beginning, at the moment before the day has asked anything of anyone at all. The room we are stepping into belongs to a woman of the Regency gentry. She is not the highest aristocracy. She is not destitute, not struggling. She is somewhere in the comfortable middle, the class that fills the novels of Jane Austen, the class that rents a pleasant house in Bath or lives on a modest but functioning estate in the country. Her income is real, her position is stable, she has 2 or 3 servants, perhaps 4. Her house is the kind of house that feels dignified from the outside and genuinely lived in from within. Her bedroom is on the 1st floor, above the formal rooms, below the servants' quarters in the attic. If the house is a good one, there is a dressing room directly adjoining, a smaller room, just for the business of getting dressed. But for now, we're in the bedroom itself. The room is a generous size, not enormous, not one of those baronial chambers you find in Gothic novels, echoing and impractical, but large enough for what it contains, and what it contains is considerable. The bed dominates. It almost always dominates. A Regency bed, a good one, belonging to a woman of modest but real means, is a 4-poster. 4 columns of dark wood, mahogany usually, rising from each corner of the frame and connected overhead by a wooden tester. And from that tester, hanging on all 4 sides, curtains, heavy fabric curtains, lined, weighted, designed to move easily on their rings. Curtains that can be drawn completely closed around the sleeper, enclosing her in a kind of room within a room. This is not merely decorative, or rather, it is not only decorative. Those curtains are the primary insulation system of a Regency bedroom. Close them, and you trap body warmth inside. The air between you and the fabric stays several degrees warmer than the air beyond it. Open them in the morning, and the room immediately feels different, cooler, wider, more awake. The difference between a closed curtained bed and an open one, on a January morning in a room where the fire went out 3 hours ago, is the difference between bearable and genuinely unpleasant. And this matters, because the Regency bedroom without a fire burning is cold. Here is something that genuinely surprises people when they think about it carefully. Not the abstract idea of cold. We know in theory that houses were cold before central heating arrived, but the specific physical reality of it, the everyday, inescapable, bone-level fact of cold that structured an entire morning. There is no insulation in the walls. There is no glass in those sash windows capable of holding warmth against a February frost. Sash windows are elegant. They are airy and well-proportioned and exactly right for the architecture of a Regency house. They are also draughty. The gaps around the frame rattle faintly in any real wind. They keep the rain out. They do not meaningfully keep the cold out. The fireplace is the only source of heat in the room. One fireplace, set into one wall, burning coal or wood, generating warmth in a rough cone in front of it, while the corners and the far wall and the air near the ceiling remain stubbornly untouched. When the fire goes out at night, which it does, because no one is tending it while the house sleeps, the room cools to match whatever the outdoor temperature is doing. Not immediately, not completely. The walls hold some warmth, and the curtained bed holds the warmth of the body sleeping inside it. But by 4 or 5 in the morning, in winter, the water in the washstand basin has been known to form a thin skim of ice. Some domestic accounts from this period describe exactly that, reaching for the water jug in the pre-dawn dark and finding the surface frozen over. Frost on the inside of the window pane, not the outside, the inside. Think about that for a moment. In a well-run household, one with a full complement of servants, a housemaid would be among the earliest people awake in the building. Rising by 4, sometimes earlier, she would move through the house in near darkness, carrying her tinder box and coal scuttle, laying and lighting the fires in the family bedrooms before the family stirred. She worked as quietly as possible. She was not supposed to be seen or heard. She was supposed only to produce warmth, as if the warmth had simply appeared on its own, the way it does in a room from a dream. And lying in the curtained bed above, the lady of the house would hear, sometimes, the sounds of this work filtering up through the floor. The soft scrape of the coal scuttle being set down, the quiet clink of the poker against the grate, the first tentative breath of a fire catching hold. And then, if the housemaid had done her work well, the very first edge of warmth beginning to spread from the hearth into the cold room beyond. That sound and that sensation were for many women the very first signal of the morning, not light, not a voice, not an alarm of any kind. The sound of a fire being lit in an empty room, and the slow arrival of warmth from across the floor. There is something quietly significant in that. There is a whole human relationship compressed into that small, unspoken exchange. The woman in the bed, the woman on the hearthrug, one warming the space for the other, neither speaking, neither, perhaps, thinking much about the other at all, and yet the one is entirely dependent on the other for something as basic as the temperature of the morning, an entire social structure, visible in a single sound before dawn. Now let us look more carefully at what else is in this room. Beyond the bed, the Regency bedroom contains a set of objects that will, in the hours to come, organize the entire day. They are worth looking at one by one, because each one points toward a different part of what this room actually was for. There is the washstand, a small table, typically, with a marble or simply a painted wooden top, designed to hold a basin and its matching ewer, the ceramic bowl and its water jug. Both are filled with water, brought up by a servant from the kitchen. This is the only water available in the room. There is no tap, there is no pipe, there is no way to warm it except to request heated water in advance, which requires forethought and is not always arranged. In winter, the water is cold, often quite cold. Cold water on the face, on the hands, was not considered a particular hardship in this period. It was simply the morning. There is the dressing table. This is the most personal piece of furniture in the room, and it deserves its own careful attention, which we will give it very soon, because what happened at that dressing table was not what most people imagine. For now, notice only where it stands. Near the window, always near the window because natural light is essential for the work done there. The surface is covered. Small glass bottles, ceramic pots with fitted lids, tortoiseshell combs, ivory-backed brushes, a hinged mirror that can be angled to catch the light, perhaps a candelabra for the dark mornings of December and January. There is a writing slope, a slanted wooden box, often beautifully made, that can be placed on any flat surface. The dressing table, a side table, the top of a travelling trunk, and functions as a portable writing surface. Inside it, paper, a small sharp knife for trimming nibs, a bottle of ink, a stick of sealing wax, a seal. The writing slope is not ornamental. It is a working tool. It will be used this morning. It is used most mornings. There are books on the bedside table or stacked on the small shelf near the armchair by the fire. What she is reading, and what she sometimes slips inside the cover of a more respectable volume to read without comment, turns out to be one of the more interesting things about this room. We will come back to it. And there are the things that do not appear in portraits or costume dramas, the things that are simply real. Under the bed, or fitted inside a wooden cabinet designed to look like a small chest, there is a chamber pot. Sometimes two. There are no indoor flushing toilets in most Regency households. The chamber pot is the fact of mourning. It is emptied by a housemaid as part of her first duties of the day, and it is so thoroughly ordinary in the domestic literature of the period that most accounts barely mention it, which means it has been almost entirely erased from the picture we carry of Regency womanhood. But it was there, every morning, in the most elegant townhouses and the most respectable country rectories alike. It is part of what this room actually was. History keeps what was beautiful. It tends to lose what was simply real. There is also the smell of the room, which no painting or novel quite captures. Beeswax polish on the wooden furniture. The good households used beeswax, which is warm and faintly sweet. Coal smoke from the fire, not unpleasant when the fire is burning well, slightly acrid when it is first catching. The faint scent of whatever soap was used the night before, usually something simple, tallow-based, though better households used milled soap with rose or lavender, and underneath all of it, the slightly close, slightly human smell of a room where someone has slept for 8 hours with the curtains drawn and the windows shut against the cold. The Regency bedroom did not smell of flowers. It smelled of warmth and wax and people, which is to say, it smelled like a place someone lived in. Now, let us come back to the woman in the bed. She stirs. This is not the cinematic version, not the sudden opening of eyes, not the graceful sitting up, not the hair already arranged and the expression already composed. This is the real version, a gradual surfacing from sleep, the body reluctant, the mind somewhere between deep rest and wakefulness, the curtains around the bed still drawn against the light, the room beyond them audible rather than visible. She has slept most likely somewhere between 7 and 9 hours. Ladies of the Regency gentry did not, as a general pattern, keep the extreme hours of the highest aristocracy, those balls that ran until 2 or 3 in the morning, those card parties that dissolved at dawn. That world existed, and for women within it, morning arrived brutally late. But for the comfortable gentry, the class we are visiting tonight, it was more common to be in bed by 11 and waking again by 8 or 1:30. She lies still for a moment after waking. The curtains are closed. Her maid has not yet been summoned. She is, for these few minutes, accountable to no one, not to the household, not to the social world waiting downstairs, not to whatever obligation or worry or unanswered letter is waiting for her on the other side of this quiet. I want to stay with that for just a moment, because I think it matters more than it might seem. The life of a Regency woman of the gentry was, in almost all of its visible hours, a life conducted in the presence and observation of other people, at breakfast, in the drawing-room, on morning calls, at dinner, in the evening parlour, in the carriage, on the street. There was almost no public hour that was not observed, no expression of feeling that did not carry social consequence, no conversation that was not, on some level, a performance of the self, of her class, her manners, her suitability, her good sense. And here, behind these curtains, before the bell has been pulled, is a moment when none of that applies. What did she think about in those few minutes? We cannot know for any particular woman on any particular morning. But we have the diaries, we have the letters, thousands of them from women of this period, and they are not all careful and composed. Some of them are startlingly honest about what the early morning felt like, what the mind moved toward in those unguarded moments before the day made its demands. And what those accounts suggest is this, that the morning, the quiet, private morning before the household properly woke, was one of the only times in the day when a woman's interior life was briefly, entirely her own. Some women used those minutes for prayer, private, unperformed prayer, not the family morning prayers that would happen downstairs after breakfast, which were a shared ritual, observed by household and servants alike. This was something quieter, something personal, a conversation conducted entirely inside. Some women used those minutes for what I can only call practical thinking, what needed to happen today, which letter needed to be written and sent before the afternoon post, which problem in the household was simmering below the surface and needed addressing before it became visible. The Regency lady, if she managed a household, and if she had one, she generally did manage it, whether or not this was acknowledged, had real and constant work to do. The morning quiet was where she often planned it, and some women simply lay in the warmth of the curtained bed and let their minds go where they chose. which, when you consider how few other hours in the day offered anything similar, seems less like idleness and more like survival. Eventually she reaches for the bell pull, a cord beside the bed, connected by a system of wires running through the walls to a bell in the servants' hall below. She pulls it. A bell rings somewhere out of earshot, and a few minutes later, the length of time depending entirely on the size of the house and the efficiency of the household, the door opens, her maid appears. This moment, this quiet opening of the door, is the official hinge of the Regency morning. It is the threshold between the private and the attended, between the woman who's been lying in the dark thinking her own thoughts, and the woman who must now, for the next several hours, begin the complex and often underestimated work of constructing herself for the day. The maid draws back the bed curtains. Light enters the room, winter grey or summer gold, depending on the season. She moves with practised ease, checking the fire, lifting the ewer to pour water into the basin, laying out the first items of the morning ritual on the dressing table, with the unhurried confidence of someone who has done this 1,000 times. And the lady of the house swings her legs over the edge of the high bed, places her feet on the small wooden bed step set precisely there for this purpose, and stands. The fire is breathing warmth into the room now. The morning light is growing in the window. The water in the basin is waiting. And what comes next? What happens at that dressing table over the next hour, sometimes two, is one of the most revealing things I've come across in all my reading about this period. Because the Regency morning toilet was not simply the business of washing and getting dressed. It was something far more elaborate, far more physically demanding, and far more privately meaningful than anything visible from outside that bedroom door would ever suggest. That is where we are headed next. The word toilet, in the Regency sense, does not mean what it means now. In 1814, to perform one's toilet was to complete the entire morning ritual of washing, grooming, dressing, and arranging oneself for the day. It derived from the French word toilette, meaning a small cloth, specifically the cloth spread across a dressing table to protect the surface, and it encompassed everything that happened in front of that cloth, at that table, in that hour or two of the morning. It was, in a real sense, the construction of a self, and it was taken seriously. Let us begin at the washstand. The basin has been filled. The water, as we've already established, is cold or close to it, unless the household ran with enough efficiency and advanced planning to have warm water delivered before the bell was pulled. In many houses this was a matter of timing and luck. In others it was a fixed and reliable part of the morning routine, and in others still warm water was considered a comfort of the unwell, not an expectation of the healthy. She steps to the washstand. She removes the loose linen nightgown she has slept in, a long plain garment, simple in construction, utterly unlike the elaborate costume she will eventually wear downstairs, and she washes. The washing is more thorough than some histories give it credit for. The face, naturally, the neck, the hands and arms. In a careful morning toilet, other parts of the body received attention as well, though not in the way a modern shower achieves it. This was methodical work, section by section, using the limited water in the basin efficiently. More water could be poured from the ewer, but the ewer held only what it held, and there was no refilling it from a tap. She uses soap. In a household of this level, comfortable gentry, a house that keeps itself well, the soap is probably milled soap, produced in tablet or ball form, smoother and more refined than the coarser household varieties. Lavender was a common fragrance. Rose, sometimes a plainer variety with less scent. The soap lathered well enough in cold water, less well than in warm, which is part of why the water temperature mattered beyond simple comfort. After washing, after the maid has helped dry her with a linen towel kept close to the fire for this purpose, she sits at the dressing table, and here is where it gets interesting. Let us talk about the skin. The Regency ideal of feminine beauty was, in a word, pale, not fashionably bronzed, not freckled by sun and wind, not anything that hinted at outdoor labour or exposure to weather. Pale, smooth, even skin was the visual shorthand for gentility. The unspoken message it conveyed was clear. This woman's complexion proved she did not work in fields or markets, or any space where the elements could touch her. Skin that had been protected, skin that was, in the language of the time, delicate. This was considered beautiful, and like most things considered beautiful, it required considerable effort to achieve or maintain. The dressing table held the tools for this effort. There are small ceramic pots with fitted lids. Inside them, cold cream. The Regency version of cold cream bore some resemblance to the modern product of the same name, an emollient preparation of water and oils or fats designed to clean and soften the skin. Various recipes circulated, some commercially produced, others mixed at home. Common ingredients included rosewater, beeswax, almond oil, and a waxy substance derived from sperm whales called spermaceti, which was widely used in cosmetics and ointments of the period. The result was smooth, faintly scented, and genuinely effective at softening and protecting the skin. Cold cream was applied after washing to restore what the water and soap had stripped away, worked gently into the face, the neck, the back of the hands, the visible parts, the parts that would be seen. There is a bottle of rosewater on the table. This one has been in continuous use since well before this period, and the Regency was no exception. Rosewater was used as a toner, applied after cleansing to cool the skin, to close the pores slightly, to leave a faint scent that was both pleasant and considered appropriate for mourning. It was accessible to women at almost every level of society, and refined enough to sit on the most elegant dressing tables in the country. Rosewater is one of those things that simply works. Generations of use had established this, even without the chemistry to explain why. There is tooth powder, the Regency equivalent of toothpaste, a dry powder applied to a small brush and used to clean the teeth. Recipes and commercially available versions varied, but many included chalk, charcoal, or a mild abrasive substance combined with something to improve the flavour, mint, cloves, or a little orris root. It cleaned the teeth adequately. A good set of teeth was, in this period, a matter of genuine social visibility, and ladies of the gentry cared about their teeth rather more than a popular history tends to acknowledge. And then there is the question of cosmetics. Here is the thing. The Regency attitude toward cosmetics was more complicated and considerably more interesting than either the powdered excess of the preceding Georgian era or the virtuous austerity that Victorian ideals would later demand. The later Georgian era had been the era of white powder and heavy artificial colour. Men and women alike had worn face powder of startling whiteness, applied so thickly that the underlying skin was barely visible. Rouge had been applied in bright circles to the cheeks. The effect was theatrical, intentional, and unmistakable from across a room. By the Regency period, this had shifted. The Regency aesthetic was, on paper, more natural, though like most things described as natural, it achieved its effects through careful and sustained artifice. The goal was not to appear as though one had applied nothing. The goal was to appear as though one's complexion was simply naturally good. The difference is subtle. The effort behind it was not. Rouge was still used, but it was applied with restraint, a light touch, worked into the skin until the colour blended rather than sitting on top of it. The aim was a healthy flush, the kind that comes from youth and good circulation, not a theatrical disc of colour on each cheekbone. Getting it right required skill, practice, and a mirror in decent natural light, which is precisely why the dressing table was positioned near the window. Some women darken their brows. A small comb with lead teeth could be drawn through the eyebrows to define and darken them. A camel hair brush dipped in a dark preparation served the same purpose. This was done lightly, with restraint. The brow in the Regency ideal was defined, present in a way that a very pale or undefined brow was not. The use of more dramatic cosmetics, white lead preparations applied to create a very pale, even complexion, was still occurring in some corners of society during this period. White lead had been used as a cosmetic for centuries, and it did produce the pale, smooth appearance it promised. It was also, as was increasingly understood by the early 19th century, dangerous. Lead poisoning through cosmetic use had been observed and written about. The fashion was in decline, but decline is not disappearance, and in certain circles the habit persisted. I mention this not to sensationalize, but because it illuminates something real about the Regency morning ritual. The women at these dressing tables were not naive. Many of them understood that some of what they used was not entirely harmless. They were operating within aesthetic and social pressures powerful enough that the calculations sometimes ran in favour of risk. We have our own versions of this, different chemistry, the same fundamental logic. Now, let us talk about fragrance. Perfumery in the Regency period was an established and genuinely sophisticated craft. The great perfumers of London and Paris, and their English counterparts, worked with botanical ingredients. Real rose, real lavender, real bergamot, real ambergris, real civet. These were not approximations of flowers processed into clean, modern simplicity. They smelled of the actual plants and substances they were made from, which is both more complicated and more interesting than the synthetic perfumes that would eventually replace them. Hungry water, a preparation based on rosemary, distilled in an alcohol base, was among the most widely used fragrances of the early 19th century, and had been in use for centuries before that. It served as a perfume, as a tonic applied to the skin, and in some accounts as a hair rinse. It smelled fresh, herbal, clean, light enough for morning, appropriate in a way that a heavier evening scent was not. Lavender water was similarly common and similarly valued. Cheaper than the more complex blended fragrances, simpler and cleaner in smell, it was the practical, elegant, every morning choice for women of comfortable means. Fragrance was applied to the wrists, the neck, the temples, and often to the dress and the hair. Fabrics of this period, silks, fine wools, light muslins, absorbed and held scent in a way that modern synthetic textiles do not, and a well-scented morning dress could carry its fragrance through an entire day of calls and visits. Let us be honest about something, because I think it matters. In an era before any form of modern deodorant, before antiperspirants, before the chemistry that would eventually manage perspiration at the source, fragrance performed more than a decorative function. The rosewater applied after washing, the lavender water at the wrists, the scented sachets stored among the linens and pressed among the folds of the dress. These were not purely ornamental, they were practical. A Regency lady was as aware of this as she was of anything else in the ritual, perhaps more so. Her maid is busy throughout all of this. In a household where the lady's maid is experienced and trusted, much of the cosmetic application is done by the maid's hands. Cold cream applied, a light touch of colour worked into the cheekbones, the hair at the temples smoothed. The maid's hands know this face. They have learned it, morning after morning in this light, at this table. They know what works. This relationship, the working relationship between a lady and her lady's maid, is one of the most intimate in the Regency household. More intimate in some respects than many friendships. The maid sees the face before it is presented to anyone else. She handles the body before it is dressed. She's present in the moments between sleep and performance that no one else witnesses. She knows which mornings arrive harder than others. She knows from the small signals that precede words when something is wrong. Whether the lady of the house noticed this intimacy, acknowledged it, valued it, that varied enormously. Some treated their maids with genuine warmth and real mutual regard. Others treated them as skilled fixtures of the room. Most existed somewhere in the complicated territory between those two things, in the mixture of dependence and distance that domestic service in this period always produced. From the letters and diaries that survive, we know that ladies sometimes said things at the dressing table that they said nowhere else. Small, unguarded things, what she was dreading about the afternoon, whether she felt she looked tired, whether the dress she had planned felt right for what was coming. The maid's response in most cases was practical. She adjusted the hair. She applied a little more colour. She handed over the lavender water and said nothing in return that was not useful, and gradually, over the course of this hour, or an hour and a half, or in some households a more leisurely 2 hours, a transformation took place. Not a disguise, not a fabrication, something more considered than either of those things. The woman who had woken behind the bed curtains, loose-haired, cold-faced, private, thinking her own thoughts in the near dark, was becoming, incrementally, the woman who would walk downstairs and be seen. The skin smoothed and brightened, the brows defined, the colour brought carefully into the cheeks, the faint, warm fragrance of rosewater and lavender rising from her warmed skin. The face in the mirror, this face, in this light, in this room, composed. Here is something I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think it matters more than it might seem. This woman was not fooling anyone about what she fundamentally looked like. Everyone in her world, the maid, the family, the social circle, knew broadly the face beneath this preparation. They knew because they were all going through the same preparation. Everyone in her world understood that the face presented at the breakfast table was a prepared face, a considered face, a face that had been attended to with care and intention. What the preparation accomplished was not illusion, it was composure. The Regency morning toilet was, at its heart, the act of becoming ready, ready to manage the household, ready to receive visitors, ready to be seen in a world that would observe her constantly and draw quiet, constant conclusions from everything she presented. The skin, the fragrance, the careful cosmetic touches, the arrangement of the hair, these were not vanity in the simple sense of the word. They were a form of armour, the kind that does not protect you from physical harm, but protects you from the social consequences of appearing unready. And the bedroom, the dressing table, the cold basin, the maid's steady hands, the pots and bottles in their careful arrangement, was where that armour was assembled every single morning before the day began. The hair, which we have not yet properly looked at, will take us even deeper into this ritual. Because what happened to a Regency woman's hair in the morning was not a simple matter of combing and pinning. It was an elaborate, time-consuming, sometimes painful process that tells you something important not just about Regency beauty, but about what it meant to be a woman whose appearance was, in very practical terms, part of her work. That is where we're going next. But before we move to the hair, let us stay at the dressing table for a few minutes longer, because there is something about this ritual, this surface, this light, that deserves more than we have given it. The dressing table mirror was usually a small hinged affair, adjustable, angled to catch the light, set at a height that required the woman to sit close and look directly and deliberately at her own face, not the passing glimpse in a hallway glass, not the fragmentary half-reflection in a darkened window. A deliberate, close, sustained examination of herself in morning light. This is stranger than it sounds when you think about it carefully. We live now in a world of constant casual reflection. Every phone, every shop window, every bathroom surface. We see ourselves dozens of times a day without particularly intending to. The Regency world was not like this. Mirrors existed, but they were not ubiquitous. Good mirrors were expensive. The dressing table mirror was, for many women, the primary place in their daily lives where they looked at themselves in any sustained or deliberate way, and they looked hard, not vainly, or not only vainly. They looked the way anyone looks when they are trying to solve a practical problem, carefully, honestly, taking in what was there and deciding what to do about it. The language of appearance in this period had a vocabulary we've largely lost. The bloom was the quality of a young, healthy, well-rested face, a luminosity, a slight natural colour in the cheeks, a brightness around the eyes. Bloom was considered the truest sign of good health and good spirits. It could not be entirely faked, though the careful application of rouge and cold cream could support it when it was genuinely present and approximate it when it was not. Women discussed the bloom of their own faces and the bloom of others with the same matter-of-fact directness that they discussed the weather or the harvest. She looked very well. She was looking rather pulled. She has quite lost her colour. These were medical observations as much as aesthetic ones. A face that had lost its bloom meant something was wrong. Illness, worry, grief, or simply the accumulated fatigue of too many late evenings and not enough sleep. The morning toilet was, among other things, the daily assessment. Was the bloom there? Was the colour even? Were the eyes clear? And if the answer was not quite what it should be, if the night had been difficult, or the worry had been sitting heavier than usual, then the tools on the dressing table were there to support what the face was not naturally providing this morning. This was not dishonesty in the social code of the time. It was care. The same care you might give a house before guests arrived. Not creating something false, but presenting what was already there to its best advantage. Something in this strikes me as both practical and quietly touching. These women were not chasing an impossible ideal of permanent perfection. They were managing a very real gap between how they felt in the morning and how they were expected to appear by the time breakfast was served. They were doing it with the tools available to them, which were modest, natural in origin, and required skill to use well. And they were doing it every single day, without complaint, as a basic condition of participating in their world. The sounds of the ritual, too, are worth noting. The gentle scrape of a comb through hair, the soft press of a cloth against the face, the small glass click of a bottle being set back on the marble-topped surface, the quiet, almost conspiratorial murmur between a lady and her maid, a word about the day ahead, a question about which earrings with which dress. The fire crackling steadily in the background. The rain, if there was rain, running down the tall window glass. These sounds, repeated every morning of a woman's adult life, became their own kind of ritual music. The sound of the day being assembled, the sound of the self being put together before it was offered to the world. There is a quiet intimacy to this hour that I do not think we fully appreciate when we read about it from the outside. The dressing table ritual was almost always spoken of in the language of necessity, what had to be done before the day began. But it was also, quietly, one of the only structured moments of daily life that was entirely focused on the woman herself, her face, her body, her appearance, her comfort. The household and its demands could wait for an hour. The drawing room and its performance could wait. This hour belonged, in a specific and protected way, to her. And then it was done. The final check in the mirror. The last adjustment made by the maid's careful hands. The rosewater settled, the colour in the cheeks just right. The brows clean and defined in the morning light. She stood. The room smelled of lavender and warm wax, and the coal fire breathing steadily in the hearth. The day was about to begin in earnest, but not quite yet, because there is still the matter of the hair, and the dress, and the extraordinary, underestimated, entirely invisible labour of getting a Regency woman from her mourning state to her presented one. That is what we are stepping into next. The maid is already at the dressing table when the ritual of the skin is finished. The rosewater has been put away. The cold cream pots have been closed and returned to their positions. The face in the mirror is ready. Now comes the hair. If the morning toilet was a ritual, the hair was its most demanding chapter. The Regency period had inherited from the decades immediately before it a complicated and expensive history with hair. Those towering Georgian constructions of powder and pomade and padding, requiring professional hairdressers and hours of work, were already becoming a kind of embarrassing memory by the time we reach 1814. The hair powder tax of 1795 had effectively killed the fashion for powdered hair almost overnight, and in the years that followed, the new style moved closer to the head, more natural in appearance at least, inspired by classical antiquity, by the Greek and Roman busts filling English collections, by the neoclassical aesthetic that shaped everything from architecture to porcelain to dress. The Regency hairstyle aimed for something closer to the image of an ancient world come quietly back to life. This was not simpler. It was differently complicated. The ideal Regency hairstyle for mourning involves soft curls arranged around the face, at the temples, across the forehead if the current fashion allowed, with the rest of the hair gathered and pinned at the back of the head, in a loose but deliberate arrangement. Evening styles were more elaborate, additional ringlets, small decorative combs or ribbons worked into the hair, more structured coils at the nape. But even the morning version required preparation, and the preparation in many households had begun the night before. Curl papers. This is one of the details of Regency daily life that most people have never heard of and find difficult to picture until someone describes it carefully. Curl papers were exactly what they sound like. Small strips of paper, cut or torn from whatever was available. Old letters, newspaper margins, brown wrapping paper, used to wrap sections of slightly dampened hair around themselves before bed. The hair would be combed through, divided into sections, each section twisted around its paper, the paper folded and secured to hold its position through the night. Then the lady went to sleep, curl papers all across her head, and woke the next morning to discover what the hours of darkness had produced. Curl papers were not comfortable. They pressed against the scalp. They rustled against the pillow. They could shift during the night if the sleeper moved, which affected the curl that appeared in the morning. They were, by most accounts, endured rather than enjoyed, a domestic price paid for a social currency. But they worked, and when the maid removed them in the morning, carefully unwrapping each paper, easing the curl free, coaxing it into position with her fingers, they could produce results that were genuinely attractive, provided the hair had the right texture and the night had cooperated. Not all hair held a curl naturally, not all nights were cooperative, and on the mornings when the curl papers had slipped, when the hair had dried at an unfortunate angle, when the weather outside promised the kind of damp that made every curl provisional, on those mornings the curling iron was required. The Regency curling iron was a metal rod, heated in the fire or held over a candle flame, then applied to sections of hair to create a curl through direct heat. The principle is identical to a modern curling iron. The materials and the margin for error were considerably less forgiving. Heating the iron required judgment. Too hot, and it scorched, a smell both unmistakable and unforgiving, a result that was visible and irreversible for the rest of the day. Too cool, and it produced nothing. The maid would test the temperature by pressing the iron briefly against a damp cloth or a folded piece of paper, watching the response, adjusting by moving the iron closer to or further from the heat source. There was genuine skill in this. The difference between a maid who had mastered the curling iron and one who had not was not a small difference. It showed. When the curling was done and the curls were arranged, they needed to be set and held. This was accomplished with pins. Small, thin metal pins pushed through the hair at strategic points to anchor what the curl papers and the iron had produced, and with small amounts of a preparation called pomatum. Pomatum was a scented fat-based preparation, often made with animal fat such as lard or bear's grease, blended with a fragrance, typically lavender or rose, applied in small quantities to help the hair hold its arrangement and give it the slight shine that was considered appropriate. Used sparingly and with skill, it was nearly invisible in the finished hair. Used carelessly, it was not. The skilled maid knew the difference. She worked it through the ends and the body of the style with a fine-tooth comb, distributing it evenly, never applying too much to any single area. Hair was not washed every morning. Let us be honest about that, because it matters for the picture we are building. In an era without hot running water, without a warm room large enough to dry hair quickly, and without the modern formulations that make daily washing practical, washing the hair daily was not possible and not expected. A woman of this class might wash her hair once a week, perhaps rather less often in winter, when wet hair in a cold room was an uncomfortable thing to contemplate. Between washings, hair was maintained, brushed thoroughly each morning to distribute its natural oils, occasionally refreshed with a small amount of scent, and kept in its style with the minimum necessary interference. All of this work, the removal of the curl papers, the coaxing and shaping of the curls, the application of the iron where needed, the placement of pins, the careful sparring with pomatum, the final arrangement of any decorative comb or small ribbon the style required, took time. For a simple morning arrangement, perhaps half an hour. For a more careful day, or on a morning when the curl papers had not cooperated, an hour or more. By the time the hair was finished, a significant portion of the morning had already passed, and there was still the dress. Let us begin with what was underneath it. The foundation layer of Regency dressing was the chemise, a long, loose garment of linen or cotton, reaching to the knee or sometimes below, worn directly against the skin. The chemise was the garment that absorbed the body's moisture and warmth through the hours of wearing. It was also the most regularly washed garment in the wardrobe precisely because it stood between the body and everything else. A dress might go between wearings without washing. The chemise could not, or at least should not. Over the chemise went the stays. I want to pause here for a moment, because the word stays arrives carrying a great deal of baggage from the wrong century. When most people think of a historical corset, the thing that required two people and determined effort, the thing that compressed and reshaped, the thing associated with faintings and tight lacing, they are thinking of the Victorian version. The mid to late 19th century corset, which targeted the waist, compressed it deliberately, and produced the hourglass silhouette that defined that era's ideal of the female body. That garment was a significant intervention. It was worn tightly by those who wished it tight, and the health consequences were real and documented. The Regency stay was a different garment in service of a different aesthetic altogether. The Regency silhouette was not the hourglass. It was the column, the high-waisted, light fabric, softly flowing line that made a correctly dressed woman look, in the most successful examples, like a figure from classical antiquity. This line required support, but not compression. Regency stays were generally shorter than their Victorian successors, not extending far below the natural waist, lightly boned with cane or whalebone at strategic points, designed primarily to lift and support the bust and to smooth the torso so that the dress fell correctly from the high waistline beneath the bust. They were typically made from cotton or linen with cording for structure and laced at the back with cords drawn through worked eyelets. They required the maid to lace them. This was not a moral or practical weakness. It was simply geometry. The laces ran up the back. You could not reach them properly yourself. The maid would stand behind, threading the cords through the eyelets with practiced efficiency, adjusting the tension evenly on both sides, checking that the line was smooth and correct, not pulling violently, not creating something theatrical, adjusting, setting, getting the foundation right so that the dress could do what it was designed to do. Were they comfortable? Probably not by any modern standard. Anything that wraps the torso and restricts free movement to any degree will be uncomfortable to a body unused to it. But women of this class had worn some form of stays from adolescence. The body adapted. The sensation for someone who had grown up with it was not acute discomfort so much as simple presence, the awareness of the garment, the slight firmness across the ribs, the way the bust was held rather than unsupported. Some women in the period wore their stays lightly. Some, in private and in the more progressive circles, occasionally went without them altogether. But for a morning that included breakfast with the household, receiving callers, or going out, which is to say for almost any morning that was not explicitly a day of illness, stays were generally part of what being dressed meant. Over the stays went a petticoat, in the colder months sometimes two, a heavier flannel one beneath a lighter one of cotton or fine linen, because the thin muslins and printed cottons fashionable in this period were beautiful and cold, and the body needed some layer between the elegant dress and the winter air, and then the morning dress itself. Morning dress was the simpler counterpart to the elaborate evening gowns the Regency period is most famous for, typically cotton or muslin, sometimes a printed cotton for those who preferred colour in their mornings, plain white or cream for those who preferred quiet. It closed at the back, the maid again, or occasionally at the front with small fasteners that could be managed with some patience. It hung from a high waist, from just below the bust in the true Empire line, and fell in soft folds to the floor. The sleeves were long and relatively plain for morning. The neckline was modest. It was not a gown designed to be noticed. It was what you wore to manage the household, to write letters, to sit by the window with a book, to be quietly at home in, and yet by every modern measure it was remarkably impractical. No pockets. Pockets required a separate pocket tied beneath the skirt, accessed through a slit in the side seam. The thin fabric provided almost no warmth. The floor-length skirt swept up dust and required gathering when climbing stairs. The soft shoes, low-cut, thin-soled, made from kid leather or cotton, essentially decorated slippers, offered no support and could be worn only in dry interior conditions. The woman who descended the staircase at 9 or 10 in the morning, in her morning dress, her hair arranged, her stays laced, her chemise layered beneath everything, her shoes in place, had spent somewhere between 1 and 2 hours arriving at this point, and the maid had spent that same hour or two working. I want to hold that for a moment, because I think it is worth holding. The story we usually tell about the Regency morning ritual is the story of the lady, her appearance, her preparation, her private hour. And that story is true. But running alongside it, every single morning was another story entirely. The woman who arrived before the bell stopped ringing, who drew back the curtains, who laid the fire, who poured the water, who removed the curl papers with careful hands, who wielded the curling iron with the precision of long practice, who laced the stays and helped the dress go over the hair without disturbing what had taken an hour to arrange, who checked the result in the mirror and made the small adjustments the lady could not see for herself. There is no account of the morning ritual that is complete without her, and yet she is almost never the subject of the account. I find something in that worth sitting with, not a simple lesson, not straightforward guilt, something more like a genuine historical recognition that for every ritual we call private, for every space we call intimate, there was almost always someone else in the room, someone whose hands made the ritual possible, someone whose name in most cases we do not know. The dress is on, the hair is set. The room has warmed to the point where the cold of the early morning is entirely forgotten. She stands. She checks herself one final time in the dressing table mirror. The maid makes one small adjustment, a pin perhaps, or the smoothing of a sleeve, and steps back. And the lady of the house does not go downstairs yet. She crosses the room to the small table near the window. She sits down. She lifts the lid of the writing slope. She takes out the paper, the pen, the ink. There are letters to be written, and in the private life of a Regency woman, that activity, what it required, what it meant, what it concealed and what it revealed, is one of the most extraordinary things I have found in all of this. That is where we are going next. But before we follow her to that desk, let us stay for a moment with what it actually felt like to be dressed this way. Because the physical experience of Regency clothing is something that photographs and paintings cannot communicate, and it matters more than it might seem. The dress, once on, changed the body. Not dramatically, not in the way a Victorian corset changed the body, but noticeably. The stays around the torso created a specific posture, upright, the chest slightly lifted, the back held straighter than it would be without support. This was not incidental. It was the intention. A woman in stays carried herself differently from a woman without them, and the difference was visible, and it was the visible difference that dress was, in part, designed to produce. Sitting down required a small adjustment. Not a dramatic one. Not the theatrical managing of skirts and structure that the Victorian era would demand, but an awareness. You sat more upright than you might naturally choose to. You placed the skirts carefully. You did not fling yourself into a chair the way someone in modern clothes might. And over time, after years of wearing, this stopped being conscious effort and simply became the way one sat. The dress itself, the light cotton or muslin of the morning gown, felt different from fabric against bare skin. There was the chemise between them, of course, the linen next to the body, the dress on top. But the overall sensation was of being enclosed, contained, structured, not uncomfortably, but definitively. There was an outside version of yourself and an inside version, and getting dressed was the process of becoming the outside version. And there was something else about Regency dress that I think is worth understanding. The fabrics fashionable in this period, the light muslins, the fine printed cottons, were genuinely beautiful and genuinely cold. The Regency silhouette was, in visual terms, one of the most elegant and graceful in English fashion history. In thermal terms, it was a disaster. Thin fabric, no warmth, floor-length skirts that let cold air move freely beneath them. Women of this period were frequently, quietly, mildly cold. Shawls were not merely fashionable accessories, they were necessary. A fine cashmere shawl, wound around the arms and shoulders over the morning dress, was as much a thermal garment as a decorative one. And the shoes, let us not forget the shoes. The Regency shoe was a delicate thing, a thin-soled slipper of kid leather or silk or printed cotton, with a very low heel or no heel at all, fastened across the instep with a ribbon or a small tie. It was designed for interior surfaces, carpeted drawing rooms, polished hallways, smooth parlour floors. It offered the foot almost no protection, almost no support, and no grip on wet or uneven surfaces. Going outside required a different shoe, and when rain made the streets or paths impassable in anything light, pattern shoes, wooden-soled platform overshoes worn over the thin indoor shoes, were sometimes used. The combination of stays, thin dress, cold fabric, and inadequate shoes was, from a purely practical standpoint, not well suited to the demands of a working morning. But a Regency lady's morning was, for the most part, not physically demanding in the way outdoor labour or active work was. It was a morning of small movements, sitting at a desk, walking between rooms, receiving callers in a parlour, moving from chair to window and back. The dress was suited to these things, even if it was suited to little else. What it required, more than physical adaptability, was a kind of practiced ease. The ease of someone who had never worn anything different, who had grown into these clothes from childhood, whose body did not find them foreign but simply found them the way things were. This ease was itself, in the period's social vocabulary, a sign of good breeding. A woman who handled her clothes badly, who fidgeted with her dress, who moved awkwardly, who seemed constrained by what she was wearing, was, by the logic of the time, betraying something. The ideal was to wear the clothes as if they were no effort at all. As if the curled hair and the laced stays and the floor-length dress had simply arrived on the body effortlessly, naturally, without any of the hour and a half of work that had actually produced them. The invisibility of the effort was the point. Something in that strikes me as simultaneously practical and quietly sad. All that work, the maid's hands and skill, the hour of the curling iron, the careful layering of chemise and stays and petticoat and gown, and the social ideal was to look as though none of it had happened, which is, come to think of it, not entirely unlike the social ideals that still govern how women are expected to appear. different clothes, different century. The same fundamental instruction. Show the result, not the work. The desk is waiting. The writing slope is open. The pen has been trimmed. Now the private hours truly begin. She sits down at the writing slope and lifts its lid, and the morning enters a different register entirely. Not quieter, exactly. The fire is still there. The distant sounds of the street still audible through the glass. But something shifts. The hair and the dress and the careful ritual of the dressing table are behind her now. Ahead of her is the part of the morning that is, in a sense, the most genuinely her own. Not because it is hidden, but because it is chosen. Because what gets written here, in the next hour, will pass through the world under her own hand and her own seal, and arrive somewhere bearing the mark of her own mind. In the Regency period, the letter was not one form of communication among many. It was the form, the only form available across any distance greater than a short walk. There was no telegraph, no telephone, no way to reach someone in London if you were in the country, or in Bath if you were in Yorkshire, or in Edinburgh if you were in Kent, except to write them a letter and wait. And people waited. Not passively, not with the low-grade anxiety of a modern person watching their phone, but with genuine structured anticipation. The arrival of the post was one of the organizing events of the day. In the country, it might come once a day, at a fairly predictable time. In town, multiple deliveries were possible, and the letters that arrived, who they were from, whether they had come at all, what they might contain, were social events in their own right, which means that the letters she's about to write this morning are not casual. They're not the equivalent of a quick message sent without much thought. Each one is a small act of composition, of social management, of relationship maintenance performed in ink on paper, to be folded, sealed, addressed, handed to a servant or taken to the post, and read by someone else's eyes in a different room in a different house, sometimes days from now. Let us look at the tools she's working with. The writing slope, which she has opened, is a slanted wooden box fitted with a green or red leather surface on which to write. Inside it, sheets of writing paper, a small bottle of ink, a pen, and a penknife. The pen is almost certainly a quill. Steel pen nibs were beginning to appear in the early decades of the 19th century, but in 1814 they were not yet in common use in domestic households. The quill, cut from the wing feather of a large bird, most often a goose, was the writing instrument of the time, and quills required maintenance. The penknife is there for exactly this purpose. The tip of a quill wore down with use, sometimes mid-letter, and needed to be recut to restore a clean writing point. This required the small, sharp knife, a certain amount of practice, and enough care to produce a clean split in the nib that would lay a consistent line of ink. A badly cut quill scratched, it splattered. It produced uneven, blotchy letters that spoke of inattention, which, in a period when handwriting was regarded as a direct expression of character, was not a small thing. Good handwriting was a serious accomplishment, not just technically, not just legible, but aesthetically. A well-educated Regency lady was expected to write in a clear, elegant hand, with consistent letter forms and appropriate spacing. Conduct manuals of the period discussed handwriting alongside music and drawing as markers of a genuine education. A fine hand was noticed. A poor one was also noticed. The paper itself was a considered expense. Writing paper in this period was made from rag, from linen and cotton fibres, not wood pulp, and it was more durable and more beautiful than most modern paper, with a texture and a slight opacity that took ink well. it was also not cheap. Paper was a household commodity that required conscious budgeting in most gentry households. This had a practical consequence for how people wrote. Letters were not profligate with paper. A single sheet folded to create 4 pages was the standard letter. When more space was needed, or when more needed to be said than the 4 pages could hold without charging extra postage, and we should talk about the postage, writers resorted to a practice called cross-writing. Cross-writing was the art of making more of a single sheet than it appeared to offer. You wrote across the page in the normal direction, filling the 4 pages of the folded sheet. Then you turned the paper 90 degrees and wrote across it again, perpendicular to the first layer of writing. The result, when held up to the light, was a dense crosshatch of 2 layers of text that required patience and a practiced eye to read, but which could accommodate twice as much content for the same postage cost. Postage was charged to the recipient in this period, not the sender. The person receiving the letter paid for it upon delivery, calculated according to the number of sheets and the distance the letter had travelled. A letter sent a long way on multiple sheets could represent a real expense for whoever received it. This created an interesting social dynamic. Sending someone a long letter full of news was in some sense a gift of attention, but also a small financial imposition. Knowing when to write at length and when to be brief was a social judgment call, not merely a stylistic one. One way around the postage cost was the franking privilege. Members of Parliament had the legal right to frank letters, to sign their name across the flap of the folded letter in a way that authorised its free delivery. Ladies with fathers, husbands, brothers, or friends who were MPs often took careful advantage of this. Getting a frank letter to the post required a little more coordination. The MP needed to be located and persuaded to sign. But the saving was real, and letters were frequently planned around the availability of a frank. Now, what did these letters actually say? On the surface, a great deal about very little. The weather. Who had called and who had failed to call? What was being worn at the assemblies? The progress of various illnesses in the neighbourhood. What had been eaten at a dinner of note? Who had become engaged and what people thought about it? The gossip of the immediate world reported with varying degrees of restraint depending on the relationship between writer and reader. This is the surface, and the surface is genuine. These things were written, and they mattered, and the social intelligence carried in a good letter was not trivial. Knowing what was happening in a distant household, knowing who was in favour and who was not, knowing which family had fallen into financial difficulty, or which match was being quietly negotiated, this information had real value in a world where social relationships were managed largely in person and by letter and almost nowhere else. But underneath the surface, the Regency letter did something else as well. It held the interior life. In a world where a woman's spoken expression was constantly observed and regulated, where she was expected in company to be agreeable, to avoid controversy, to temper her opinions, to be careful about what she said and how she said it, the letter offered a different kind of space. Not entirely free, because letters could be read by the wrong people, because they survived and could be quoted against you, because they existed in the physical world with all the vulnerabilities that implied. But freer than speech, in a letter to a trusted sister, or a close friend of many years, a woman could say that she found a person tiresome in ways she could not say at the dinner table. She could express doubt about a decision she was expected to outwardly support. She could be funny in a way that her social context did not always permit. She could be sharp. She could be despairing. She could briefly be exactly as intelligent as she actually was without the social consequences that intelligence could sometimes carry in a drawing room. The letters of women of this period that have survived, and many have survived, in family collections, in county archives, in published editions, are consistently more interesting than the social world they describe expected their writers to be. The wit is drier, the observations are more precise, the irritation is more honestly stated. That detail stays with me, not surprising exactly, but worth saying plainly. The women were more interesting in their letters than they were allowed to be in their lives. The letter was the place where the actual mind showed up. She writes. The quill moves across the paper with the slight scratching sound of nib on page that is, if you have ever heard it, one of the most distinctive sounds in the world. Occasionally she pauses, dips the quill back into the ink bottle, waits a fraction of a second for the excess to drain, and continues. Occasionally she stops entirely, thinks, and then writes again. The pace is different from modern typing, slower, more deliberate, each word placed with more conscious intention, because the physical cost of changing it is higher. When the letter is finished, it must be sealed. She folds the sheet carefully, in the manner specific to the period, a sequence of folds that brings the written surface inside and presents the plain exterior for the address. The address is written on the outside of the folded packet, across the top third of the exposed surface. Then the seal. She picks up the stick of sealing wax. A red or dark sealing wax was standard, though other colours existed, and holds one end to the candle flame. The wax melts and runs. She tilts it and lets a small pool of the melted wax fall onto the junction of the folds at the back of the letter, where the paper must be secured. Then quickly, before the wax hardens, she presses her seal into it. The seal is a small instrument, typically of brass or silver, with a design cut into its face. It might bear an initial, or a family crest if the family had one, or a simple decorative motif. When pressed into the warm wax and lifted away, it leaves a precise impression, a miniature image in the surface of the cooling wax that identifies the sender as clearly as a signature and secures the letter against casual tampering. The wax takes only seconds to cool. The letter is sealed. It now exists in the world in a fixed and final form that belongs in some sense no longer entirely to her. She puts it aside, or she takes up another sheet to begin the next letter, or she rings for a servant and gives it to be taken to the post, depending on the urgency and the time of day, and whether the morning post has already gone. In a household like this one, a well-managed gentry household with a regular correspondence to maintain, there might be 2 or 3 letters written on a given morning, sometimes more. Letters to a mother or sister in a distant county, updating them on the household's affairs, a letter to a friend about an engagement or an illness, a letter managing some piece of practical business, a tradesman's account, a question about a journey, an arrangement for a forthcoming visit. Each one requires this same careful process, the thought, the composition, the physical act of writing, the seal. And when the letters are done, there is something that happens in the room that I want to name because I think it is real, and because the period almost never names it directly. A kind of quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not pride, simply the quiet contentment of work completed. A stack of sealed letters on the desk, the ink dry, the wax set, representing an hour of sustained and useful effort that will soon travel out into the world and bring something back in return. A reply, an acknowledgement, news, connection. In a life that was, in many ways, quite circumscribed, that stack of letters on the desk was one of the clearest visible records of a woman's reach. How far her relationships extended, how many people were waiting to hear from her, how many places in the world considered her voice worth receiving. It was not a small thing. The letters will be collected and taken to the post, or given to a servant to carry on foot to their local destinations. They will go. And in the meantime, the morning is still here, the bedroom is still here, or the small sitting room adjacent to it, or the window seat where the light is best. And there is still the question of how the hours between letter writing and luncheon were spent. The private hours, the hours no one was asking about and no one was scheduling. Those hours were not empty. They were in some ways the most inhabited hours of the day. But before we move to those hours, let us stay a little longer with the letters themselves, because there is something about the incoming post that deserves as much attention as the outgoing one. At some point during the morning, often at breakfast or shortly before it, or brought in by a servant who had collected it from the local post office, letters arrived, letters from other people, and the arrival of a letter in this world was not a neutral event. It was, depending on its source and content, any number of things, good news or bad, relief or fresh anxiety, the continuation of a friendship or the beginning of a complication. It could be a letter from a sister with news of the family in a distant county, a letter from a friend detailing the most recent social developments in London, a letter from a tradesman requiring a reply, a letter from someone whose handwriting, seen on the folded exterior before the seal was even broken, could produce a quite physical reaction, quickened breath, or a tightening of the chest, or something quieter and harder to name. The sealed letter, before it was opened, was a small container of unknown information. Breaking the seal was an act that could not be undone. What was inside would be known, and knowing it would change something, even if only slightly, even if only the colour of the next hour. This is not a trivial point. In a world where communication was slow and unreliable, where a letter sent today might take 3 days to arrive, where no reply could be expected for a week or more, where news of illness or death or a family crisis could be delayed long enough to make the delay itself a form of suffering, the arrival of the post had an emotional weight we've almost entirely lost. We check our phones dozens of times a day. Every notification is low stakes precisely because there will be another one in minutes. The Regency letter arrived once or twice, and it carried everything that had accumulated since the last one. Women of this period were, by the evidence of their surviving diaries and their own letters, genuinely attentive readers, not just of content, but of tone, of what had been said and what had been conspicuously avoided, of how a letter from a close friend compared to earlier letters from the same friend, whether something had shifted, whether there was more constraint than usual, whether the warmth was real or performed. Reading a letter, in other words, was its own skilled practice, as demanding in its way as writing one, and for letters that were worth keeping, those from people who mattered, those containing information that might be useful later, those that were simply well written and a pleasure to have. There was the question of where to put them. Letters were kept, not all of them, but many of them, stored in boxes, in the drawers of the writing slope, in special tied bundles. A woman's collection of received letters was, over the course of a life, a kind of archive of her relationships, who had valued her enough to write, who had written well, who had written through difficulty, and who had gone silent when things became complicated. Looking back through old letters was a thing Regency women actually did. Reading back over a year's correspondence from any one person told you something about how the relationship had changed. It was a form of history-keeping at the level of the personal. Some letters were destroyed. This was also a deliberate act, and it was sometimes done for reasons of protection. A letter containing something too frank, too politically sensitive, too emotionally exposed, too revealing of a third person's private affairs. These were sometimes burned rather than kept. The choice of what to preserve and what to commit to the fire was a curatorial judgment about which parts of the past were safe to carry forward. This is why the surviving letters of women from this period are so valuable and so tantalizing. What survived is not a complete record, it is a curated one. Some of the most interesting material was destroyed precisely because it was the most interesting material. The letters we have are, in many cases, the ones that were considered safe enough to keep, and they are still remarkable, which gives you some sense of what has been lost. There is one more thing about the writing desk and its rituals that I want to name before we move on, and it is something that the letters themselves often could not quite say directly. Writing was power. Not the large public power of governance or finance or law, from which women of this period were largely excluded. Not power in the sense that the 19th century would have used the word for women at all, but a quiet, real, portable power, the power to frame events, to set the record of what had happened, to decide which version of a situation reached distant ears. A woman's letter describing a difficult family situation, or a neighbour's scandalous behaviour, or the failure of a promising match, her version of events was the version her correspondent received. It was, for the people she wrote to, the truth. In a world that gave women very little formal authority, the letter gave them something in its place, the authority of the first account. The power to say what happened and how it felt and what it meant. Not to everyone, not publicly, not in the ways that would eventually create legal or financial or institutional change, but to the people who mattered to them. And in those relationships the letters were definitive. She puts the pen down, the ink on the last letter is drying, the sealing wax is set. The morning's correspondence is finished. The room is very quiet now. Outside, the street has settled into its midday rhythm. Inside, the fire has found its pace. The clock on the mantelpiece marks the time without comment. And there is still the question of how she spends the next hour or two before the household's midday arrangements begin to assert themselves. She reaches for the book. And here is where something shifts, in a way that I want to be careful about describing correctly, because the hours between the completion of the morning letters and the demands of the midday household were not idle hours exactly. They were not empty. But they were, in a way that is genuinely unusual for a Regency woman's day, hours that belonged to her without apology. Let us talk about what she did in them: reading, needlework, music. These are the three great private occupations of the Regency gentry lady, and they are worth taking seriously as occupations, rather than dismissing them as the gentle pastimes of people with nothing important to do, because each one of them, examined carefully, turns out to be considerably more interesting than the word pastime suggests. Let us begin with the book. Reading was, in the Regency period, a complicated pleasure. Not complicated in the sense that it was difficult to do. Literacy among women of the gentry class was high, and reading was a skill that most women of this station had possessed since childhood. Complicated in the sense that what you read and how much you read and what kind of thing you were caught reading said something about you. Something that not everyone was comfortable with other people knowing. The most controversial reading material for women of this period was the novel. This seems absurd from our current position. Novels are simply books, We do not think of them as morally or intellectually dangerous. But in the Regency period, a significant and vocal portion of educated opinion held that novel reading was genuinely bad for women. The argument went roughly like this. Novels encouraged women to expect excitement, drama, romantic feeling, and emotional intensity that real life could not and should not provide. They filled the female mind with unrealistic expectations. They caused agitation where there should be calm. They were, at their worst, a kind of mental seduction, leading the reader away from the real duties and real pleasures of her actual life, and toward an imaginary world that was better, brighter, and more interesting. Conduct manuals of the period regularly cautioned against excessive novel reading. Mothers worried about what their daughters were absorbing. There was a persistent cultural anxiety about the female reader, in a room by herself with a book, unsupervised, being taught things by an author she had never met. And yet novels were enormously popular. Enormously, undeniably, demonstrably popular. The circulating library, a subscription service found in almost every town of any size, where books could be borrowed for a small fee rather than purchased, was, in the Regency period, almost entirely sustained by the appetite for fiction. Novels were the circulating library's principal offering and its principal draw. Women were its principal customers. The novel that arrived from the circulating library in its brown wrapping, or that was slipped under a more respectable volume of sermons or natural history for the walk home, or that was hidden inside a pillowcase and read by candlelight after the household had gone to sleep. That novel was not a guilty pleasure in the modern sense of the phrase. It was a genuine pleasure pursued in the face of genuine social disapproval. A small private act of intellectual independence. What were they reading? The range was wider than the critics of the genre tended to suggest. Gothic novels, those atmospheric, sometimes genuinely frightening tales of crumbling abbeys and mysterious counts and heroines in peril, were enormously popular in the decade or two before our period, and continued to be read throughout it. Books by Anne Radcliffe, who had transformed what the Gothic novel could do, were still circulating and still being discussed. The sentimental novel, its predecessor, and sometimes its companion, had shaped an entire generation's emotional vocabulary. But the years between 1811 and 1815 also saw the arrival of something new. Novels that were not Gothic, not sentimental, not obviously sensational at all. Novels that were, on the surface, about ordinary people in ordinary circumstances making ordinary decisions, and that were somehow more interesting than almost anything that had come before. Novels that saw the social world of the Regency gentry with a clarity and a wit that was, to anyone paying attention, rather alarming. These were being read, discussed quietly, passed from household to household with a word of recommendation that was sometimes quite careful about how enthusiastic it was, because enthusiasm could raise the question of whether the reader had recognized herself in something. Beyond fiction, there was poetry. Byron was, in the years around 1814, one of the most famous people in England, a level of fame that reads, from our current distance, more like what we would now call celebrity than what we usually associate with literary reputation. His narrative poems were read by everyone. Young women copied his verses into their commonplace books. His emotional register, darkly romantic, self-consciously passionate, slightly dangerous, was exactly calibrated to appeal to the kind of reader who spent her mornings in a quiet bedroom with a private hour and a good reason to want something to feel intensely about. History was read. Travel writing was read. Natural history, botany in particular, was a legitimate and even encouraged interest for women of this class, who were considered suitable students of the natural world in its more delicate forms. Sermons were read, or at least kept prominently enough on the dressing table that they would be visible to visitors. She reads, "The fire is steady, the room is warm, the clock on the mantelpiece marks the passing of the quiet, and in her lap, or on the table beside her chair, or tucked into a work bag beside her, is the needlework. Let us talk about the needlework." Needlework was not optional in the Regency gentry world. It was, in the most literal sense, an expected female accomplishment, alongside music, drawing, and a reading knowledge of French. To do needlework well was to demonstrate patience, fine motor skill, aesthetic taste, and the kind of quiet, sustained attention that the period associated with feminine virtue. To do it badly or not at all was to suggest a deficiency in all of those things simultaneously. But needlework was also work, not just metaphorically, not just symbolically. It produced useful things. Plain sewing, hemming, mending, making simple garments was genuinely necessary in a household that could not afford to discard everything that showed wear, which was most households. The sheets and pillow slips and curtains and tablecloths of a Regency household required constant maintenance. When a hem came down, someone had to put it back. When a nightgown wore thin at the sleeve, someone had to reinforce it. That someone in a gentry household was often the lady of the house, working alongside the female servants on the plain sewing that kept the linen functioning. This was not glamorous. It was not the embroidery frame in the sunlit drawing room. It was practical work, done because it needed to be done, and it sat alongside the finer needlework without much distinction in the daily record of how a woman spent her time. The finer work, the embroidery, the netting, the fine white work on muslin collars and cuffs, was the public face of needlework, the part that was displayed and admired. Embroidery on a fire screen, a set of cushion covers in progress, an altar cloth begun for the local church. These were the works that visitors noticed and commented on. They required real skill. A well-executed piece of embroidery in the correct style represented months of patient effort and the mastery of complex stitch vocabulary. And netting. Netting produced small mesh bags, caps, hairnets, decorative borders, small delicate objects made with a simple netting needle and shuttle, the thread looping through itself in an endlessly repeated action that could be done without looking down, which meant it could be done while listening to someone read aloud, or while carrying on a conversation, or while sitting at a window watching the street below with half the mind engaged elsewhere. This is actually one of the more interesting things about needlework as a private occupation. At its most practiced, it freed the mind. The hands knew what they were doing. The eyes tracked the work but did not require the whole attention. The mind could go where it chose. It could think about the letter just written and what the reply might say. It could rehearse a difficult conversation. It could travel in imagination somewhere else entirely. The woman at her needlework was visibly occupied, visibly virtuous, visibly useful, and her thoughts were her own business. There is something almost subversive about that, when you think about it carefully. The very activity that was most associated with quiet feminine compliance was also one of the few that gave the mind genuine liberty to wander. The hands performed domestic virtue while the mind did whatever it liked. There is something in that quietly magnificent. And then there is music. The pianoforte in a Regency gentry household was typically located in the drawing room rather than the bedroom. It was a large instrument, and the drawing room was the room where it could be heard and appreciated and could function as an accomplishment on display. But the private relationship a woman had with music was quite separate from its public function. Practice happened in the early morning, often before the household was fully awake, in whatever room the instrument occupied, and it was a different kind of engagement from the performance that happened in the evening when guests were present. To play well, genuinely well, not just adequately, required daily practice. Real practice, working through scales, returning to difficult passages, pressing at the technical problems that the evening performance glossed over with confidence. This was not for an audience. This was for the instrument and herself. Some women loved the piano with a seriousness that went well beyond social obligation. The music they played, the sonatas of Haydn, the lighter pieces of Clementi, the songs being composed by the period's popular composers, the arrangements of Scottish and Irish folk melodies that were fashionable in these years, was not background. It was, for those who loved it, a form of expression unavailable in most other parts of their day. Playing music when no one was listening is a specific kind of privacy. It is not the privacy of being alone in a room exactly. It is the privacy of the full attention, the absorption that music produces when you're inside it rather than performing it, where the demands of the piece occupy so much of the mind that the usual social calculation quiets, where, for the length of a movement, you are just the music and the instrument and the morning. This absorption, in reading, in needlework, in music, was, I think, what the private hours were really for. Not productivity in any measurable sense, not the completion of tasks, but the recalibration that happens when a mind is allowed to go somewhere without being observed, judged, or managed. In a life that asked constant performance, constant management of appearance and tone and expression, the private hours asked nothing. They simply offered the morning and the warmth of the fire and the quiet. The bedroom, in these hours, was not a room in the house. It was a different country entirely. One that had its own rules, or rather, the absence of the rules that governed everywhere else. You could read the wrong book here. You could let the needlework fall into your lap and simply look out of the window for 10 minutes without anyone asking what you were thinking about. You could play a piece of music 3 times in a row because you were not satisfied with it, without worrying what anyone heard. You could be, for a little while, entirely unobserved, and I want to be careful here, because I do not want to romanticize what was, in many ways, a constrained life. The private hours were not compensation for the rest. The bedroom was not a sufficient world. The social life that waited downstairs, the calling, the dinners, the assemblies, the management of relationships within a very small and very observant world, was the main event, not the interruption. But the private hours were real. They were inhabited. They mattered to the women who had them, and the loss of them, to illness, to a household that suddenly required everything, to a social calendar that filled every gap, was noticed and recorded as a real loss. That is what I find most human about this particular corner of the past. Not the grand events, not the romantic plots. The fact that women in 1814 had a favourite chair by a specific window, and a book they were in the middle of, and a piece of needlework they kept returning to, and a particular piece of music they had been working on for weeks. Small, specific, quiet things that mattered to them, which is not so very different from now. In a moment the private hours are going to end. The household is going to make its claims again. Visitors may be expected. The social machinery is about to start up. But first, let us understand what happened when the bedroom itself became a social space. Because this, the question of who came into this room, and when, and why, and under what conditions, is one of the stranger and more fascinating aspects of the Regency private world. But before we get to the callers and the social machinery, let us stay a little longer in the quiet. Because the texture of these private hours, what they actually felt and sounded and looked like from inside them, is worth dwelling on. The reading spot mattered, not just any chair, not just any corner. Women of this period were particular about where they read, in the way that people who read seriously and regularly are always particular about where they read. In letters and diaries from the Regency, the window seat appears again and again, the cushioned recess of a deep sash window, where the light came in at the best angle, and the view offered both the outdoor world and the excuse to look up from the page without having to explain yourself. Sitting in a window seat with a book was a specific named pleasure. The light on the page, the slight coolness of the glass if you leaned your shoulder against it, the street or the garden visible in the periphery, the book in the foreground. It was a position of simultaneous interiority and connection, absorbed in the text but not sealed off from the world, alone but not entirely removed from it. Some women kept a commonplace book. A commonplace book was a personal anthology, a bound notebook into which you copied passages that struck you, from whatever you were reading, from a poem that said something exactly right, from a sermon that made a point you wanted to remember, from a letter received if the language was good enough. The commonplace book was a record of a mind engaging with texts over time, which passages caught, which lines were worth preserving, which ideas seemed important enough to set down in your own handwriting where you could return to them. It also produced a very personal document. Someone's commonplace book tells you, with considerable precision, what kind of intelligence they had and what kinds of thoughts they were drawn to, which is probably why many of them were kept as private as the letters, treated as personal documents, not intended for public view. The work basket sat nearby. In a well-organized gentry household, the work basket was a constant companion of the private morning hours, a wicker or decorated fabric container holding the current projects, the thread and needles and small scissors, a thimble, perhaps a small piece of card with the pattern of the current embroidery stitched into it. It travelled between rooms as its owner travelled. It appeared in the bedroom for the private morning. It appeared in the drawing room during afternoon calls, where working at needlework while receiving visitors was not only acceptable but expected. The hands occupied, the mind available for conversation. The needlework was never entirely finished. This was, in a way, its social function. It was always in progress, always requiring attention, always there to be picked up and set down as the demands of the moment required. A piece of embroidery that took months to complete was not a failure of efficiency. It was a companion, a quiet thing to do with the hands when the mind needed to be elsewhere. And the music. Let us return to the music for just a moment, because I want to say something about practicing that I think gets lost when we talk about the piano as a social accomplishment. When she practiced, really practiced, alone in the early morning before anyone else was about, or in the quiet of the room she had to herself, the piece she was working on was not an accomplishment. It was a problem, a specific technical musical problem that she was trying to solve. A passage in the left hand that refused to be smooth, an ornament that needed to arrive at exactly the right moment, a section where the two hands needed to move independently but together, which is harder than it sounds and requires the kind of patient, slightly obsessive repetition that is available only to someone who is alone and has time and genuinely cares about getting it right. The satisfaction of getting a difficult passage right after many attempts when no one is listening, That is one of the real pleasures of practicing music. Not the applause, not the compliment at the end of the evening. The moment when the thing that wouldn't work, worked. When the hands do what the music requires, and for a few seconds everything is exactly as it should be. She knew that satisfaction. It was available in the private hours in a way it was not available elsewhere in her day. Mistakes in the drawing room were noticed. Mistakes in the bedroom on a Thursday morning mattered only to her. Outside the window the morning has fully established itself. The street is awake now, properly awake. The sounds more frequent. The light settled into its daytime quality. The earlier grey burned off and replaced with whatever the day has decided to offer. If it is summer, the window might be slightly ajar, and the sounds come in more clearly. Voices, wheels, birdsong if the garden is near enough. If it is winter, the window stays closed and the room is its own small climate, warm and sealed, separate from the cold that lies just beyond the glass. The clock has moved. An hour has passed, perhaps more. The book has been read, or the letters have been finished, or the needlework has advanced a little way, and the thread has been cut, and the thimble has been put back in the basket. Something in the house shifts, a sound below. Footsteps in the hall, the sound of the front door being opened and closed by a servant checking for callers. The private hours are ending, but before they end entirely, the door of the bedroom itself is about to open, and what comes through it is not, as you might expect, a servant with a message. It is a visitor, a guest, someone who has been admitted by the specific social codes of the Regency to this most private of rooms, and the story of who could enter this room, under what circumstances and what their presence here meant, is a story that tells you something quite specific about how the Regency world managed the boundary between the public and the private. That is what we're about to explore. The door opens and someone comes in. Not a servant, not the maid, someone else entirely. A visitor, a caller, a person from the social world outside this room who has been admitted by a specific and somewhat complicated set of social rules to a space that most of the world would never see. This needs some explaining. In the Regency period, the term morning call referred to a social visit that took place not in the actual morning, but in what we would now call the early afternoon. The day was divided differently then. Morning meant the pre-dinner hours, everything before the main meal of the day, which in polite society was typically served at 4 or 5 or sometimes later. Morning, in this usage, extended from whenever the household woke until the dinner hour. Afternoon calls, confusingly called morning calls, were typically paid between 11 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, with the midday hours being the most common. The rules around calling were elaborate and exact. You arrived at a house. If the lady of the house was at home, which meant available to receive you, you were shown in by a servant and conducted to the drawing room, where you would spend somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes in conversation before taking your leave. If she was not at home, you left your visiting card and departed. Here is the thing about not at home. It did not necessarily mean she was absent. It meant she was not receiving. The lady of the house could be sitting in the drawing room 6 feet from where the servant was telling you she was not at home, and this was perfectly acceptable. It was a social fiction, understood by everyone to be a social fiction, and it carried no particular stigma in either direction. She was exercising her right not to be available. You were accepting her right to do so, and demonstrating your own good manners by leaving your card and departing without comment. The visiting card was the currency of this system, a small rectangle of card engraved with the caller's name, sometimes with their address, sometimes with a short title or designation. When left at a house, it told the household that you had called and been turned away, and it initiated an obligation, a reasonable expectation that the visit would eventually be returned, the card eventually reciprocated, the social relationship maintained in its proper form. Cards could also be sent without a personal visit in certain circumstances. A card sent to congratulate on a birth or a marriage. A card sent to express condolences after a bereavement. The card stood in for the person, carrying the weight of the social obligation in a more efficient form. When a call was accepted, when the lady was genuinely at home and the visitor was admitted, the social theatre that followed had its own careful choreography. The length of the visit communicated something. 15 minutes was a duty call, fulfilled and complete. Half an hour suggested genuine interest. An hour was a mark of real intimacy or a rather pressing need to talk. The topics appropriate to a morning call were lighter than those appropriate to a more private conversation. General news, neighbourhood affairs, observations on the weather and the social calendar. Nothing too personal, nothing too difficult, nothing that could not be resumed or abandoned without awkwardness when another caller arrived. Which brings us to the bedroom. Because while the drawing room was the correct site for the morning call, the bedroom was not, in all circumstances, off limits. In fact, for the closest friends, the sister, the intimate of many years, the confidant, being received in the dressing room or even the bedroom was a mark of distinction rather than a breach of propriety. It signalled a relationship so close that the social performance was not required. You could come in before the presentation was complete. You could see the face before the rouge was perfectly set. You could sit in the chair by the dressing table and talk while the maid finished the hair. That was intimacy of a specific and valued kind. In fashionable London society, being received in a great lady's dressing room while she completed her morning toilet was sometimes actively sought. It meant you were inside the circle, admitted to the space where the public self was still being assembled, trusted with the version that existed before it was ready for general inspection. It was a social compliment of the most direct kind, but the bedroom became a truly public space, in the most deliberate and regulated way, under one specific circumstance, and that circumstance was childbirth. Let us talk about the lying in. In the Regency period, childbirth happened in the bedroom, not in a hospital, not in a clinical setting, not with the support of modern medicine. In the bedroom, in the bed, attended by a midwife and sometimes a male physician, who in polite society was increasingly called in for difficult births, and whose involvement was itself a social statement about the family's means and modernity, and surrounded by female relatives and close female friends who were present not merely for emotional support but as a social witness. The lying in was the period of confinement that followed a birth. For women of the gentry class, this period could last several weeks, 4, 6, sometimes more, depending on the recovery and the custom of the household. During this time, the mother remained primarily in the bedroom, confined to bed or to the room, and the bedroom became a space that received a carefully managed stream of visitors. This was not informal. The lying-in visit was a social obligation with its own protocols. Female relatives came first, typically, and were admitted to the room. Close friends followed. Acquaintances might be received in a sitting room adjacent, or might simply leave their cards. Gifts were brought, often practical ones, items for the infant, things for the household. The new mother, propped on her pillows, received her visitors in the bedroom in an arrangement that looks almost impossibly public from our current distance. but which was, in this world, entirely normal. Think about what that means for a moment. The bedroom, the most private room in the house, the room where the morning ritual happened behind closed doors, the room that the calling card system existed precisely to keep the wider world out of, became, for the duration of the lying in, a quasi-public room. A room in which social relationships were managed, social obligations fulfilled, and social position confirmed or adjusted, all while the woman at the centre of it was in the most physically vulnerable state of her life. The ability to receive those visitors well, with appropriate composure, appropriate warmth, appropriate management of the occasion, was itself a social performance, and it was performed from bed. There is something in that quite extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the sense of outrageous. It was ordinary, it happened all the time, it was simply the texture of this world. But extraordinary in the sense of genuinely strange when looked at from outside. The bedroom, the private, the public, these categories were not as separate as we tend to assume. They overlapped, they shifted, they traded places depending on what the social situation required. Illness in general had a similar effect, though usually in a milder and more voluntary form. When a woman was unwell enough to be confined to her room, but well enough to receive company, the bedroom again became a receiving room. The sick visit was a social institution of considerable importance. To fail to visit a sick acquaintance, or to visit too briefly, or with insufficient evidence of concern, was a social failing that could be noted and remembered. To visit well, with the right frequency, the right duration, the right combination of sympathy and cheerful restraint, was to demonstrate a social character of the highest order. The sick-room visit had its own etiquette. You did not stay too long because the patient needed rest. You did not bring distressing news because excitement was considered medically harmful. You did not ask too many questions about the illness itself because this could be indelicate. You brought something small and useful, a pot of broth, a jar of preserves, a book you had enjoyed and thought might pass the hours. You sat for 15 or 20 minutes. You were warm and calm, and you made the sick person feel valued without making them feel like a spectacle. When the illness was serious, the visiting became more frequent and more intimate. When recovery was uncertain, the women who sat with the patient, who read to her, who kept her company through the long, slow days of convalescence, were performing an act of friendship that went well beyond social obligation. They were keeping someone company in a place where company mattered more than almost anywhere else. The room witnessed all of this. The same room that had held the private mourning, the curl papers and the cold cream, the sealed letters and the private reading. This room also held the birth of children, the slow recovery from illness, the carefully managed visit of a sister or a close friend who'd been admitted past the social threshold because the relationship required it. It was, in a sense, the room that knew everything. There is one more element of the bedroom's social life that I want to name before we move into the afternoon, and it is a small one, but I think it matters. Sometimes, not rarely, but regularly, two women of close friendship or family relationship shared a bedroom, not by poverty or necessity, though necessity could be a factor, but by choice, or by the ordinary arrangements of a household where rooms were finite and relationships were close, sisters sharing a room, or a married woman and a visiting friend, or a woman and a female relative staying for an extended visit. The shared bedroom was a different kind of space from the solitary one. It held a different quality of intimacy, the intimacy of unguarded proximity, of conversation in the dark before sleep, of the other person's presence in the room during the morning ritual. of sharing the fire and the small irritations and the small comforts of the day's beginning. We know from the surviving correspondence of women of this period that the relationships formed and maintained in shared bedrooms were often among the most significant of their lives. Not romantic necessarily, though sometimes, but intimate, held at a level of mutual knowledge that the drawing room and the formal visit simply could not accommodate. The bedroom in this world was not simply private. It was the place where the most real versions of social relationships lived, the ones that did not require performance, that survived the absence of witnesses, that continued in the dark after the candle was snuffed and the formal day was finally over. That is where we are headed next. Into the afternoon, and then the long preparation for the evening that will take this room and this woman through the final hours before the bedroom is returned to its original purpose. But before the afternoon arrives, let us go back for a moment to the calling card. Because the calling card, small and plain as it looks, turns out to carry a considerable amount of the social logic of this world. The card was typically about the size of a modern business card, though proportions varied. It bore the caller's name, engraved, not printed in cheap ink, because the quality of the card said something about the person. The name was the primary information, Mrs. So-and-so, Miss Such-and-Such. A married woman's card carried her husband's name, or her own, depending on context. An unmarried woman's card typically included her first name to distinguish her from other members of the family. A titled card required the title. The card was a miniature portrait of social identity. Cards were managed with care. Received cards were kept, in a card tray on the hall table typically, or in a dish in the drawing room. Looking through the card tray was an informal way of knowing who had called recently, whose name appeared most often, whose card had not yet been returned. The card tray had a small social memory. It recorded in rectangular fragments the shape of the household's relationships with the world. When you left a card without being received, there was a protocol around how the card was presented. Sometimes a corner was turned down, sometimes it was left flat and straight. The exact meaning of these small physical variations was a matter of some debate even in the period itself, varying between households and regions and decades, and conduct manuals occasionally contradicted each other on the specifics. What was consistent was the awareness that these small gestures communicated something, even when the something was not entirely fixed. The hierarchy of calling was equally precise. In a new neighborhood, or after a significant social event such as a marriage or a move to a new house, there were rules about who called on whom first. Social rank determined the obligation. The person of lower social standing called first, paying deference to the higher. The person of higher standing then returned the call, conferring recognition. To get this backward, to expect the call to come to you before you had offered it, was a social error that identified you as someone who did not fully understand the system. This is worth pausing on for a moment. The calling system was, among other things, a technology of social legibility. It made visible who knew whom, who valued whom, who owed whom a social debt, and who had decided to let a relationship quietly lapse. All of this information was encoded in the cards left and the calls made and the visits returned or not returned. The social world of the Regency was small enough, at least within any given county or town, that this information circulated efficiently and was read carefully by everyone involved. A woman who was strategic about her calls could, over time, reshape her social landscape. She could cultivate relationships with the right families by calling more frequently and with more warmth than pure obligation required. She could allow relationships that no longer served her, or that she had simply grown tired of, to quietly attenuate by letting the card go unreturned just a fraction too long, by being not at home just often enough that the other party received the message without an uncomfortable conversation ever needing to take place. It was not manipulative in any simple sense. It was social management, the necessary, constant, low-level work of maintaining relationships in a world where those relationships were the primary medium through which a woman's life was conducted. And the bedroom was where the thinking about all of this happened, where the morning letters planned the social strategy, where the private hours processed what had been said at the last visit and what needed to be said at the next one, where the specific anxieties of the social world, who was cooling toward her, who had been warm in a way that required careful consideration, were turned over in the quiet before the day began. Now, let us talk about the lying in more carefully, because I touched on it briefly, and it deserves more attention. Childbirth in the Regency period was, by any modern measure, dangerous. Maternal mortality from complications of childbirth, from infection in the days following delivery, from conditions that modern medicine now routinely manages, was real and significant. Women of the Regency period knew this. They had attended at the bedsides of women who did not survive their confinements. They had read the letters that brought the news of a friend or cousin who was gone. Childbirth was faced with courage that is easy to miss when we look at it from the outside, because the courage was quiet and ordinary and everyone shared it. The lying-in room was prepared in advance. The bed might be fitted with older linen that could be removed and washed without concern. A fire was kept burning. Warmth was considered essential, and cold after delivery was feared. The midwife arrived, or the physician, or both. Female relatives gathered. The husband, if present in the house at all during the delivery itself, was typically in another room. Birth was, in this period and in this class, an affair managed by women for women, with male medical intervention called upon if complications required it. After the delivery, assuming it went well, assuming the mother survived and the infant survived, the lying-in proper began. The mother remained in the bedroom. The room was kept warm and relatively darkened. She rested, fed the infant if she was nursing, received the carefully managed stream of female visitors, and gradually, over weeks, recovered. The lying-in visit had a specific emotional register. It was warm, quiet, celebratory, but not excitingly so. Visitors admired the infant. They expressed relief and delight at the mother's survival and recovery. They brought gifts. They did not stay too long. They did not disturb the rest that was understood to be necessary. The room held a kind of tenderness during this period, a quality of relief and softness that the bedroom, in its ordinary working life, did not often have occasion to display. When the lying-in ended, when the mother was recovered enough to leave the bedroom, to descend the stairs, to resume the ordinary life of the household, a kind of ceremony marked the transition. The church offered a service of thanksgiving for safe delivery, commonly called churching, which formally signalled the end of the confinement period and the mother's return to public life. After churching, the bedroom was an ordinary room again. The extra attendants were gone. The careful management of visitors was no longer required. The room resumed its private character. I think about that transition sometimes. The bedroom that had held a birth, that had been full of women and warmth, and the specific gravity of a life arriving in the world, returning to the quiet of the ordinary morning. The fire tended by the housemaid, the washstand and its cold water, the writing slope with its letters to be written, the curtained bed, the same room resumed. There is something very quiet and very moving about that continuity. The room holds all of these moments and presents them equally. It does not mark the extraordinary days differently from the ordinary ones. The same walls, the same window, the same view of the garden or the street. The room continues, and so does she. The afternoon is establishing itself. The light through the window has shifted. The calling hours are drawing toward their close. A last visitor may have come and gone, or may still be in the drawing room below. Somewhere in the house, preparations are beginning for the dinner hour, the kitchen producing evidence of its work in sounds and smells that drift upward through the floors. She will go downstairs soon. She will manage the late afternoon and the dinner and whatever follows. But before that, before the evening performance begins, there is one more private interval in the bedroom, one more specific ritual that very few accounts of Regency life bother to describe, and which turns out, when you learn about it, to be one of the most distinctive and most human things about this world. The afternoon rest. It has almost no presence in the popular imagination of the Regency period. The novels don't often mention it. The costume dramas skip over it. The histories of manners and social life tend to focus on the events, the dinner, the assembly, the call, and leave the interval between them largely undescribed. But it was real. It was a recognized and accepted part of the day for women of the gentry class, and it happened in the bedroom, and it is worth understanding what it actually was. After luncheon, the informal midday meal, light by the standards of the day, often cold meats and bread and perhaps something sweet, taken without ceremony in the dining room or sometimes simply carried on a tray to wherever the afternoon found her. She returned to the bedroom, not for sleep necessarily, not because she was unwell, for rest, for the specific practice of lying down in the middle of the day that the period considered not laziness, but reasonable care. Medical thought of the early 19th century was broadly supportive of afternoon rest for women, not because women were considered weaker than men exactly, but because the management of one's constitution, the careful attention to what the body needed in order to remain in good working order, was considered an active responsibility. You were not simply a vessel that either held up or collapsed. You were the manager of your own health, and part of good management was giving the body what it required, and what it required in the afternoon, after the exertions of the morning and before the exertions of the evening, was a period of quiet horizontal rest. The rest happened on the sofa or chaise longue if the bedroom had one, which in a well-furnished bedroom it often did, a daybed or a narrow upholstered couch positioned near the fire or near the window, covered with a light blanket or a shawl. Or she lay on the bed itself on top of the counterpane, without the full business of getting into it, simply lying down in her afternoon dress, eyes closed, the room quiet around her. Some women slept, a genuine afternoon nap, brief and sound. Others did not sleep but rested, that suspended state of horizontal wakefulness that is neither sleep nor alertness, where the mind moves slowly and without direction, where thoughts arrive and drift away without requiring response, where the body settles and the tiredness of the morning, which may not even have registered as tiredness until now, is quietly absorbed. There is something about lying in a warm room in the middle of the afternoon, when the light outside has shifted to its own late afternoon quality, and the sounds of the house have quieted to their midday minimum, that is unlike any other time of day, a specific quality of stillness, not the morning's busy private quiet which is full of purpose and the anticipation of the day to come. Something slower than that, something that accepts the day as already substantially happened, and does not require anything more of you quite yet. I want to stay with this for a moment, because I think the afternoon rest is one of those things that our current way of life has made genuinely difficult to access. We do not typically lie down in the middle of the afternoon. We do not consider it acceptable in most contexts. The afternoon is a working time, a productive time, a time when things should be being accomplished. The idea of being horizontal for an hour in the middle of it feels, in most modern lives, like failure or indulgence or at best a symptom of illness. But for the women we have been following through this day, the afternoon rest was simply part of the day's architecture. It was built into the structure of things. It existed between the morning, which was for private occupation and social management, and the evening, which was for the formal world. It was the hinge between them, the pause in which the transition could happen, and while she rested the day caught up with her, not in the anxious sense, not as intrusive thoughts demanding attention, more like the natural settling of water after it has been disturbed. What the morning had brought, the letter received and read, the visitor who had said something interesting or something puzzling, this small worry that had been set aside while the hands were busy with needlework and the eyes were on the book, these things came back now, in the quietness, and were permitted to settle. She thought. Not productively, not in a way that required anything to be written down or decided, just thought. Let the mind move where it would, without the social performance that governed almost every other waking hour, requiring it to stay within certain boundaries. The bedroom, in the afternoon light, was still the same country we noticed in the morning, the one where the rules were different, where the self was permitted to be a little more fully itself than anywhere else in the house allowed. This rest lasted perhaps half an hour, perhaps an hour, in some households, in some seasons perhaps longer. It ended not with an alarm, but with the gradual return of awareness, the sounds of the house reasserting themselves, the light through the curtains shifting toward the amber of late afternoon, the knowledge that the dinner hour was approaching and the evening was about to make its demands. She sits up. She moves to the window and looks out for a moment at whatever the afternoon has become outside, the street, or the garden, or the fields if the house is in the country. The light is different now from the morning, lower and warmer, angled from the west, making the familiar view look slightly different from how it looks at any other time of day. Then she rings for the maid, because the evening preparation is about to begin, and the evening preparation was everything the morning toilet was, and more. The morning had been about assembling a self-adequate for the private and semi-private hours of the day, comfortable, presentable, appropriate for the household and for morning callers. The evening was something different. The evening was for the public world in its fullest form. The dinner table, the assembly rooms, the theatre, the concert, the card party, the drawing room of another household, where the candlelight would be brilliant and every detail of what she wore would be registered by eyes that were paying attention. The evening dress was almost always silk, or fine muslin of a quality that caught and held the candlelight in a way that morning cotton did not. White and cream were fashionable in the earlier years of the Regency, but colour was not unusual. Soft blues, pale pinks, a deeper rose or amber for women who wore colour well. The neckline was lower than for morning dress. The sleeves were shorter, or non-existent in the most fashionable styles, leaving the arms bare from shoulder or elbow. The whole effect was lighter, more deliberate, more exposed, and the exposure was the point. Evening dress was designed to be seen, to move well in candlelight, to communicate, through fabric, through colour, through the bare arms and the carefully displayed neck, something about taste and station, and the degree of attention that had been paid to the presentation of oneself for the occasion. All of this required the maid's hands again. The hair that had been arranged this morning, the curls set with the curl papers, and the iron, the arrangement pinned in place before breakfast, had been worn through the day and had shifted. Some pins had loosened, some curls had lost their precision. For the evening, the hair required rebuilding. Not entirely from the beginning. The structure was still there. But the maid worked through it again, repinning, recurling where necessary, adding the additional ornament that evening called for. A small comb of tortoiseshell or gilt worked into the arrangement at the back, a ribbon threaded through, a few additional small curls coaxed into position at the temples to frame the face for candlelight rather than daylight, which demanded a slightly different placement. The cosmetics received a similar treatment. The morning's rosewater and rouge had worn through the day. The evening required a fresh application, slightly more deliberate than the morning, because candlelight was forgiving of more and required more in return. The cheeks needed more colour to register at the dinner table than they did in the drawing-room by daylight. The brows were redefined. The skin was refreshed with a light application of cold cream and then set again. She stood before the mirror in a different light from this morning's. The candles were lit now. It was growing dark, or the room was simply not capturing enough of the remaining daylight for the careful work of the dressing table to proceed without them. The candlelight changed what the mirror showed. It softened some things and emphasized others. The woman in the mirror at 6 in the evening was the same woman who had looked back in the morning, and was also not quite the same. Something more formal, something more deliberately assembled. The dress went on last, the silk or the fine muslin, lifted over the arranged hair with the maid's practised help, settled onto the shoulders, fastened at the back. The shoes, different from the morning ones, appropriate to dancing or to a carpeted drawing-room. Jewellery, earrings, a necklace, perhaps a bracelet, chosen to complement the dress and the occasion, and the shawl. Almost always the shawl, because the carriage and the street between it and the door were cold, because the evening air was not warm enough for bare arms, however fashionable, because a fine cashmere or Norwich shawl was itself a statement that deserved to be seen, draped with that studied carelessness that was actually precision that the period considered elegant. The maid stood back. The lady stood before the mirror one final time. Here is a thing I want to say carefully. This moment, this final inspection before the evening began, was not the moment she was most herself. The private morning, the quiet afternoon, the bedroom with its fire and its books and its rare quality of being unobserved, those were the moments of the most herself. This moment was the other thing, the moment of the most intentionally presented. But I do not think that makes it less real. The woman in the mirror at this hour had spent a whole day on the interior, on the private ritual, on the letters and the reading and the needlework and the afternoon quiet, and was now choosing, with full awareness and considerable skill, to present a version of herself to the world. That version was constructed, that version was deliberate, and that version was also genuinely her, not a mask, not a falsehood, a considered expression, shaped by her taste and her circumstances and her understanding of what the evening required. We all do this. The clothes chosen for the occasion, the self assembled for the occasion. The Regency woman at her mirror before an evening engagement was doing something we recognize, even if the specific garments and the specific mirror and the specific social world were entirely different from anything we have ever inhabited. She is ready. The maid collects the morning's scattered things, the curl papers that were removed and left on the dressing table, the pot of cold cream, the clothes from earlier in the day that need to be put away or aired. She moves through the room with the efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times, returning it to order, making it ready for the night that is coming. Below, a carriage may be waiting, or footsteps in the hall announce that the hour for setting out has arrived, or the household is dining at home tonight, in which case the stairs are just below and the dining room is already lit. The bedroom will be quiet while she is gone. The fire will be left low, maintained enough to keep the chill from the room, burning down slowly in her absence. The bed has been turned down by the maid, the top sheet folded back, the pillow arranged, everything ready for the body that will return to it eventually, at whatever hour the evening releases her. For now, she leaves the room. The door closes behind her. The evening begins. But I've moved too quickly, and I want to go back briefly, because between the afternoon rest and the evening preparation, there is a middle passage that I skipped over too lightly. Let us talk about the luncheon. The midday meal, called luncheon or nuncheon, or sometimes simply the cold things on the sideboard, was the least formal meal of the day. The main event was dinner, served in the late afternoon or early evening, and dinner was the occasion for the household to gather, for guests to be received, for food to be prepared and presented with some ceremony. Luncheon was the other thing, a quiet, practical refueling at the approximate middle of the day, taken without much ritual and without much expectation. What this looked like varied by household. In some houses, luncheon was laid on the dining room sideboard, and the family helped themselves when they were ready. Cold meats usually, whatever had been prepared and could be served without reheating, bread, cheese, perhaps some small cake or biscuits, a glass of wine, perhaps, or water. In other households it was more organized than that, laid at a table and eaten with the family, though still without the ceremony of dinner. In the simplest households, it might be nothing more than bread and butter taken in whatever room the morning had left you in. What it was not was a social occasion in the way that dinner was. You did not dress for luncheon. You did not manage the conversation with the same attention you brought to the dinner table. It was practical. It was quiet. And after it, the afternoon rest. The rest itself had a quality I described earlier, but there's one more thing about it worth mentioning. What the light did. The light in a Regency bedroom in the middle of the afternoon was different from the morning light, and different from the evening candlelight, and it was different in a way that is worth attending to. It was the light of an ordinary day at its most established. Not the blue-grey of the early morning, not the angled gold of late afternoon, but a steady and somewhat neutral daylight that showed the room without drama. The curtains might be half drawn if the rest was intended to be peaceful, and the sun was coming in too directly. The room in this half-light had its own quality of ordinary continuity, the familiar objects in their familiar places, the fire murmuring quietly, the world outside at its own midday business, and not asking anything of the room. To rest in this light was to rest in the day itself rather than to escape from it. A pause in the middle of something, not a retreat from it. When she woke from this, or surfaced, if she had not slept, the preparations for the evening had a different texture depending on what the evening actually held. A quiet evening at home, family dinner, reading afterward, no guests, required the least transformation. A change from the morning dress into something slightly more formal for dinner. The hair tidied but not rebuilt. A little more colour if she felt like it. Perhaps a different ornament. This was, by the standards of the period, barely a preparation at all. The bedroom served as a quick refresh station. 5 minutes with the maid, and she was done. An evening at someone else's house for dinner, the most common form of social evening, required considerably more. The full evening dress, the full hair arrangement, the full cosmetic attentiveness. This was the public presentation, and public presentations required complete assembly. And a ball, an assembly ball, or a private ball at a great house, required everything, plus something extra. The anticipation was different. The specific details of the dress mattered more. The hair was constructed more carefully because it would be seen in motion, on the floor, from every angle, by everyone. The jewellery was chosen with careful attention to the dress and to the woman wearing it. The evening shoes, perhaps silk, perhaps satin, thin-soled and light, were almost absurdly inadequate for anything except dancing, and were perfect for exactly that. On ball nights, the preparation in the bedroom had a quality of excitement that was distinct from the ordinary evening dressing. Not the excitement of anxiety, though some of that was usually present. The excitement of something beginning, of a door between the ordinary life and something larger, more vivid, more fully inhabited, about to be opened. The maid sensed this and worked accordingly, with more care, more attention, a little more time given to the arrangement that she would normally accomplish efficiently and move on from. On ball nights she and the lady might try something slightly different with the hair, a new placement for the comb, a slightly more ambitious curl at the temple. They worked in the mirror together, adjusting, reconsidering. And when it was done, when the ball dress was on and the hair was finished and the long gloves had been drawn up over the bare arms, the woman in the mirror was a version of herself that she inhabited perhaps once a week, twice in a good week, and that required all the preparation of this room and this hour to produce. She looked. She was ready. The threshold between the bedroom and the evening was the doorway out, the moment of stepping from the room, descending the stairs, entering the carriage if there were a carriage, or stepping out onto the street toward the assembly rooms. The movement from the private world to the public one happened in a single physical step, and it was instantaneous and complete. The bedroom closed behind her, the room that had held her entire day, from the curtained darkness of the early morning to the warm afternoon quiet to the candlelit evening preparation, resumed its waiting. The fire burned down slowly. The dressing table sat with its bottles and its pots, the mirror empty now. The bed, turned down by the maid before she left, waited with the steady patience of furniture that has always known it would eventually be needed. Whatever the evening held, the dinner, the conversation, the dancing, the hours of social performance in all its various registers, the bedroom knew she would return to it. It had always been the beginning of the day and the end of it, the private country that existed at both ends of the public world and made that public world possible. She would come back, she always did, and when she did, the last ritual of the day would begin. She comes home. It is late, later, perhaps, than she intended. Evenings had a way of extending themselves, of finding one more thing to say, one more hand of cards to play, one more song to be performed before the carriages were finally called for. The dinner that was supposed to conclude at 10 found itself still in conversation at past. And then the carriage, and the cold night air on her face for the few seconds between the door of the house she was leaving and the door of her own conveyance, and then the rocking and the darkness of the carriage journey home through streets that were quieter now than when she left them, the lamps burning lower, the night settled and still. She is tired, not the sharp tiredness of illness, not the exhausted heaviness of physical labour, a distinctive tiredness, A day that has asked a great deal, asked it in the small, constant, sustained way that social life asks, and has now, finally, finished asking. The house is quieter than when she left it. The servants who were active in the early evening have mostly retired, but the maid has waited. This is one of the understood duties, not always written down, not always formally arranged, but present and real in a well-run household. The maid waits, however late the evening runs, to be there for the return, for the undressing, for the last rituals of the night. She appears when her mistress comes upstairs, already moving, already knowing what needs to happen and in what order. The bedroom is warm. The fire was banked low during the absence, but before coming to wait the maid would have built it up again, so the room greets the returning woman with the warmth that the morning worked so hard to establish, and that the evening ends by simply providing. The curtains are drawn against the dark outside. The candles on the dressing table are lit. After the bright candlelight of wherever the evening was spent, the chandelier-lit dining room, the brilliant assembly room with its wall sconces and its moving bodies, the bedroom candles look different, softer, more contained, a private light for a private room. Now the long process of the morning runs gently backward. The maid begins with the jewellery, the earrings, unclasped and laid in the small dish on the dressing table where they belong, the necklace, unfastened from behind the neck and coiled carefully, the bracelet slipped from the wrist, each piece returned to its place with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows this work and has done it 100 times. The small sounds of metal against the dressing table surface, the only thing breaking the stillness of the room. Then the hair. The evening arrangement, which took time and care to assemble, comes apart now in the maid's hands. The pins are drawn out one by one and collected. Pins were expensive, small individual objects worth gathering and returning to their pincushion rather than leaving scattered. The ornamental comb is removed. The curls, which held their shape through the evening, are now loosened, combed gently through, returned to something closer to the natural state of hair at rest. The maid's hands in the hair, loosening rather than arranging, have a different quality from the morning, less precise, more releasing. This is not construction. This is the gentle undoing of what the morning built. The face is washed again, the evening cosmetics removed. Cold water, in the same basin that held the morning's cold water, applied with a cloth and then with a little of the cold cream. The pots on the dressing table, which have been here since this morning, are opened again for the second time today, and their contents applied for the second time, smoothing away what the evening put on. The face in the mirror at this hour looks different from either the morning face or the evening face. Neither presented nor private, simply present. The face that exists when there is no particular reason to be anything at all. The dress is unfastened, the back hooks released by the maid's fingers, the fabric loosened and lifted away. The stays are unlaced, the cords drawn through the eyelets in reverse order from the morning, the petticoat, the shoes already set aside, and finally the chemise that has been worn since morning is removed, and a clean nightgown, long, loose linen, is drawn down over the head in its place. The nightgown is its own kind of comfort. It is not beautiful. It is not designed to be seen. It is simply made for the body at rest, loose enough to move freely in, long enough for warmth, soft with washing. Putting it on is a signal, recognized by the body even before the mind consciously registers it, that the day has ended, that nothing more is required. The maid turns down the bed, if it has not already been done. She checks the fire. It will not be tended again tonight, and she leaves it at a level that will hold some warmth through the early hours before it finally goes out entirely, some time well before dawn. She tidies the dressing table with quick, quiet efficiency. She takes the evening dress to be aired. She collects the pins. She moves through the room with the unhurried competence of the last duties of a long working day. And then she says good night, and she is gone. The door closes softly behind her, and the room is as it has not been since early morning, quiet, occupied only by one person. The private world of the bedroom returned to itself after the long business of the day. She does not immediately go to bed, not quite yet. Some women, in these last quiet minutes before sleep, kept a journal. The private journal was a different creature from the letters. Letters were written for a reader, even when that reader was an intimate. They had an implied audience, a shape determined by what could be shared, a voice calibrated to the relationship. The journal had no audience. It was written for no one, or written for the writer herself, which is a different thing from nothing, but different also from every other form of writing in her day. In a journal, she could say what she had not said anywhere else, what she had actually thought at dinner when the conversation moved in a direction she could not honestly engage with, what the evening had felt like from inside rather than from outside, whether she was happy, whether she was not, what she hoped for tomorrow, and what she feared, and what she was simply very tired of. Women who kept journals in this period often note, reading back over their own entries, that the journal was the most honest record of their interior life. More honest than the letters, which were still performances of a kind. More honest than the face they presented to the household and to the social world. The journal was the place where the self arrived at something close to its own actual account of things. She sits or she lies on the bed propped against the pillows, and she writes a little. Not a great deal, a paragraph perhaps, or a page, a brief accounting of the day, the weather, which was such and such, the letter received from her sister, which contained this interesting news, the dinner, which was pleasant, or tedious, or better than expected, the one moment, just one, chosen because it stood out, that she wants to keep. The candle on the nightstand is warm and very still in the windless room. Then she closes the journal, puts it in the drawer of the bedside table, or on the shelf, or underneath the pillow if the household is not entirely to be trusted, and she's quiet for a moment. For many women of this period, the last private act of the night was prayer, not the family prayers that had perhaps happened earlier in the day. Those were the public prayers, the shared ritual, the performance of faith within the household. This was the other kind, the kind that happened in the dark, or by the dying fire, or in the curtained warmth of the bed itself. Private conversation with something larger than the day's concerns. Gratitude, perhaps. Or simply the naming of what mattered, held briefly in words, before the words were released. Whatever form it took, it was unobserved. As the morning had begun with private thought behind the closed curtains, the night ended the same way. The interior life returned to itself. And now, finally, the bed. She crosses the room and gets into it. In cold weather, especially in winter, the maid would have run a warming pan through the sheets before retiring. A long-handled covered pan filled with hot coals passed between the layers of linen to warm the surface of the bed before the body arrived. The warmth left by the warming pan was exactly what it sounds like, the specific warmth of a bed that has been prepared for you, that is already at a temperature your body can settle into without the first shock of cold sheets. It was one of the small domestic reliefs of a cold climate that is easy to miss until it is not there. She draws the bed curtains closed. The heavy fabric falls around her on all four sides. The candlelight from the room beyond the curtains diminishes to a warm glow, filtered through the fabric. And then she reaches for the candle on the nightstand, the one candle she has kept burning, the one source of light inside the curtained space, and she snuffs it. Darkness. Complete darkness, such as very few people in the modern world ever actually experience. No streetlight coming through the curtains. The curtains are closed. No screen glow, no ambient light from the electronic furniture of the modern room. Nothing. Just the very faint warmth of the fire through the fabric, imperceptible to the eye, but present as warmth. She lies in the dark. The room around her is its own small world of sound. The fire settling quiet now, giving off heat rather than noise. The rain, if there is rain, and there is rain tonight, there is almost always rain, because this is England, and the rain comes with the same regularity as the morning light. The rain on the glass of the window, very quiet now. A sound that is barely different from silence. The distant sound of a church clock marking the hour in the near dark town or the village, or the road below the country house window. 1, 2. The number of strikes settling into the air and then gone. These sounds were the last sounds of her day. Not dramatic sounds, not conclusive sounds. Sounds that had been present at the edges of the day all along, and that announced themselves now only because everything else had fallen quiet enough to hear them. The fire, the rain, the clock. She had woken to a cold room and the sound of a fire being lit. She was going to sleep to a warm room and the sound of a fire breathing down. The day she'd passed through, the curl papers and the cold cream, the letters written and the book read, the needlework and the afternoon rest, the evening dress and the dancing and the long carriage ride home, was over. Tomorrow the bell would ring, the curtains would be drawn back, and it would all begin again. But not yet. Not yet. Right now she is warm, and the darkness is complete, and the rain is very quiet on the glass, and there is nothing required of her. Whatever woke you today, whatever thoughts or worries or list you carried into this evening, they can rest now too. The fire is breathing quietly somewhere nearby. Outside, if there is a window, the night is doing what nights do, simply being dark and still and itself, which is a comfort if you let it be. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight. Let the fire have the room. Let the darkness have the quiet. Let the hours pass in whatever way hours pass when we're not watching them. This has been Sleep History with Sikandar, and if this journey through a Regency bedroom, from the grey light of the first fire to the warmth of the curtained night, has made your own evening feel a little slower, a little richer, a little more settled in its own quiet, then it has done what I hoped it would do. Sleep well.